Chapter 171. Perhaps it should be said this way. The battle had ended before it even began. The silver disciples of the Black Flames were as weak as newborn chickens in front of the elven heavy infantry of the Phoenix Guards who had mastered elemental power. The Silver Elves had a long lifespan and were a proud race that highly valued combat techniques. Their heavy infantry didn't just have outstanding physical attributes and excellent equipment. When you were faced with a warrior who had been constantly improving their combat techniques for hundreds of years, you could imagine how helpless you would be. A single glance or a single movement was enough to betray one's intentions in the eyes of the elite Silver Elves. Brando couldn't help but laugh when he saw the disciples of the Black Flames trying to show off their pitiful combat skills in front of the elven warriors. Even with his experience, he didn't dare to be rash in front of these true combat machines. To the Silver Elves, combat was an art and the pursuit of beauty. Vulgar, so vulgar. The Silver Elves couldn't believe that after hundreds of years, the Servants of Darkness would use such crude combat skills to fight against them. 7 centuries ago, the Dark Dragon, the Myurnas, and the other servants were the strongest enemies of all intelligent beings. They had the most advanced civilization, the most advanced magic, and the most amazing combat skills. They had never been hostile to civilization because the cruel and dark rule represented the most advanced civilization in the world. The combat skills of the Servants of Darkness were so fascinating that many of their brethren joined the darkness. Who would have thought that after just a few hundred years, they would have regressed to this extent? No, this wasn't even combat skills anymore. It was simply unbearable. The disciples of the Black Flames obviously didn't expect that their final resistance would provoke the anger of the Silver Elves. In fact, it wasn't just them. Perhaps other than Brando, everyone present was ashamed of the Silver Elves' opinion. That's right. After the War of the Holy Saints, civilization didn't improve. Instead, it was regressing. The supreme power that both sides of the war possessed had long become a legend. But no matter what the others thought, the dust had already settled before the battle truly began. In the blink of an eye, the disciples of the Black Fire sect had turned into cold corpses on the ground. Black blood flowed out from the headless and cold bodies and spread along the uneven ground in the forest like a network of black blood vessels. The white-haired young man seemed to have been nailed to the ground by an invisible force. His mouth was wide open and he couldn't utter a single word. After a long while, a crisp sound was heard. Everyone subconsciously turned their heads and saw that it was the big man from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. His great sword had fallen to the ground with a clang, but he didn't seem to realize it. He was looking at the elven royal guards who had stopped and regrouped with a shocked expression. The Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but look at Brando in shock. What kind of person could have 20 holy knights as guards? Could it be that this young man was actually a prince of Kurlutz and was just passing by? Although this speculation was a little ridiculous, it seemed that the former was more acceptable than the fact that 20 living paladins appeared in front of him. But just as everyone was in a daze, the red-haired girl put down her spear and stood between the elves and the white-haired young man. Her intention was clear. She didn't want to let these elves kill Reedy. The red-haired girl looked up and pursed her lips. Her expression was solemn. She already knew that she wasn't a match for any of these elven warriors. But even so, the battle intent in her eyes didn't subside. She lowered her center of gravity slightly and leaned forward. She was already in a fighting posture, like a female leopard that was about to go berserk. Scarlet. The girl's action was too familiar. It almost made Sanford and the others think that she was still the Scarlet of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Scarlet, that bastard is a traitor. Why are you still protecting him? The burly man couldn't help but shout. Only this once, the red-haired girl gritted her teeth, but she shook her head as if she wanted to get rid of the thought, only this last time. I can't watch him die here. Scarlet. Reedy was stunned. This time, he could see the shadow of the Scarlet in the girl's back. Get out of here. The red-haired girl shouted angrily, "Go find Lord Conrad." Rady was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses and scrambled to run away. But Brando's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise when he saw this. With his rich experience, he instantly caught the struggle of the Crimson Knight. It was a rejection reaction. This meant that the girl's consciousness hadn't completely disappeared. What she said before was completely based on her own consciousness. Otherwise, why would a cold and emotionless being like an oracle take the initiative to protect another person? This meant that the oracle was still in her newborn form. When Brando realized this, he suddenly understood why the Crimson Knight turned into a ghost knight. He couldn't help but give her a thumbs up in his mind. She was willing to sacrifice her existence to fight against the invasion of the blood of God. This girl really has character. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but respect her. But respect was one thing. He couldn't let that disgusting narcissist escape. He, Brando, wasn't the kind of person who liked to let a tiger return to the mountains. That bastard was obviously not going to let him off. Who knew if he would turn into an Ultraman and cause trouble for him? Even if he didn't have a protagonist's aura, what if he hurt the Roman or the people around him? Wouldn't it be too late for regrets? He decisively made a hand gesture. His meaning was clear. Knock that girl out and kill that bastard behind her. The elven commander beside Brando was slightly stunned. For the first time, he looked at the young lord in surprise. The hand gesture that Brando made was not simple. It was one of the hand gestures that the ancient commanders often used in the War of the Holy Saints. These hand gestures had developed to a considerable extent. In this era, there weren't many people who knew the hand gestures from 7 centuries ago. But being surprised was one thing. The commander's face was cold and he quickly passed down the order in a professional manner. There was no doubt, wanting to escape from the care of 20 holy cathedral knights was obviously a fantasy. Even if there was a gold-ranked existence supporting from the side, the result would still be the same. Balagon, a ruin left behind by the Silver Elves before the glorious year. The Lizardman commander, Hugel, occupied the largest hall in the ruins. This hall was probably used by the Silver Elves for worship and important ceremonies. But like other buildings, after being abandoned for centuries, this once majestic hall had become dilapidated. Perhaps it was due to their instincts, or perhaps due to their incomplete evolution, the lizard men were still unable to break away from their close relatives' habits. Hugel himself still maintained a strong sense of territory. He had long regarded this hall as his personal property and anyone who dared to touch it was tantamount to challenging his authority among the lizard men bandits. But what made Hugel proud was that he had always admired his own sense of aesthetics. Compared to those smelly fellows, he naturally tidied up the hall like a true civilized person. The center of the hall was laid with a red carpet like it was a few hundred years ago. Around the red carpet were various furniture of different styles that were snatched from who knows where. These furniture were not stacked together in any particular order, but Hugel especially liked this aspect. He was the one who ordered his subordinates to stack these furniture together. This was so that he could admire them daily. When Conrad and the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames opened the door and entered the hall, the three of them snorted coldly. The Dark Bishop did not want to see these two annoying faces, while the Dark Bishop did not want to see the vulgar aesthetics of this undeveloped and simple-minded reptile. At the very least, the mercenary commander could not see the difference between this hall and a garbage dump. "Donald, I heard that you died there." Hugel straightened the collar of his trench coat, which he had snatched from a passing noble. His wrinkled face was filled with pity as he said, "What a pity, it's fake news. It's only one. Let me remind you one last time, my name is Conrad." The mercenary commander was not in the mood to correct the strange crew's grammar that the lizard man had learned from somewhere. He only reminded the lizard man not to pronounce his name with a retroflex sound. "It's all the same." Hugel looked at the Dark Bishop behind him and said with a smug expression, "I thought that you wouldn't come." Conrad snorted coldly. You used the excuse of investigating the tomb of the Silver Elven Kings, but I think you're quite content with being a bandit. He looked around. The things you stole must be worth a lot of money, right? The lizard man Hugel's frown deepened as he shook his head. No, no. Let's get down to business. Then what did you discover? Yes, a little bit. But there's not much progress. Hugel shook his head. We can't get close to the temple. But this thing can help me. He stretched out his skinny hand and shook a necklace. Wizard, I need some. Conrad and the Dark Bishop looked at each other. The lizard man Hugel was using the excuse of investigating the tomb of the Silver Elven Kings to act as the local tyrant. Everyone thought so, but they did not expect him to really be here. But now was not the time to be anxious. The mercenary commander reorganized his speech and said, That's not a problem, but we have something we need your help with. I've already helped you once. Hugel said unhappily. He had already attracted the attention of the other adventurers when he sent the message to the Grey Wolves mercenaries. There are benefits for you. The Dark Bishop said in a low voice. What kind of benefits? A big fish. Conrad's expression was solemn. Paw. A muffled sound rang out. Brando grabbed the youth's white hair and pressed his head into the ground, causing him to cry out in pain. From the information Rady revealed, the truth was obvious. Even though Brando did not want to accept this result, he had to admit that the plot had changed. The other party had already set their sights on him. He should have thought of this earlier. He changed the way he completed the quest and the entire plot was reversed. The previous guide did not mention the betrayal of the Crimson Spirit Knight and Rady, nor did it mention that Conrad would be the first to enter the Balagon ruins. In other words, the other party had completely given up on tracking Bugha and Makarov, and focused on searching for him. This was all a facade created by that damned sly fox. Even though Brando was furious, he had to admit that the other party's plan was successful. It caused him a lot of trouble and made him angry. The consequences were severe. Amandina did not say a word after hearing Rady's description. After a long while, she suggested, Should we retreat temporarily, my lord? But Brando waved his hand. If they wanted to cause trouble for him, they had to be prepared to pay the price. Well, this plot seems to be the final path to 100% completion. I want to see how powerful these disciples of the Black Flames are. Isn't it just a plot with the highest completion rate? Brando thought to himself. It's not like I haven't experienced it before. I want to see how Lady Martha plans to reward me with this completion rate. But just as he was about to flip out, Sanford carefully approached him and whispered, My lord, what about Scarlet? Brando turned around and saw the future spirit knight lying on the ground as if she was asleep. A few elven warriors were guarding her. That was impossible. Not to mention what the new Grey Wolves mercenaries would think. Even he himself would not agree to it. Scarlet had already formed a connection with the Eversong card set. If her fate was irreversible, the best outcome would be the same as Medisha. But because she was a newborn angel, and according to Rady's description, she was sealed by a low-ranked priestess. Perhaps she could be saved. I'm not a madman who wants to seal anyone into a card, but I'm willing to do so if it's possible to save this girl with her personality. Moreover, he might even have a gold-ranked subordinate out of thin air. Therefore, he replied without thinking, Bring him along. After all, he's your companion. Maybe he can still be saved. Really? Sanford exclaimed excitedly. Brando nodded, I can only give it a try. Sanford quickly nodded. He knew that Scarlet's condition was not normal. What about this bastard? Amandina looked at Rady with disgust and asked softly. Sanford seemed to have regained his strength when he heard Amandina's words. He struggled to raise his head, and his face was filled with tears mixed with mud. He shouted with all his might, You promised that as long as I told you everything, you wouldn't kill me, I'm a man of my word. Brando nodded. He clapped his hands and stood up, looking at the silver elf beside him. Commander, I'll have to trouble you to do it for me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 172. If he wanted to achieve a 100% completion rate, he would need to uproot all the enemies in front of him. The difficulty of this mission was far greater than what Brando had imagined. He originally thought that he only needed to save the Grey Wolves mercenaries, but now it seemed that he was too naive. The Amber Sword's mission system is not easy to fool. Even in this world, it still shows its true colors. Even though that was what he said, Brando still cursed the members of the Torrential Rain mission 100 times in his heart. He counted the number of enemies he would have to face. The Grey Wolves mercenaries mentioned that there were more than 100 lizard men bandits, but the mission guide clearly stated that there were more than 1,000 of them, perhaps even more. Then there were the disciples of the Black Flames. Their numbers would not be less than 200, and their strength would be above iron rank. Lastly, there were the 70 dark mercenaries under Conrad, whose strength was similar to the disciples of the Black Flames. The Paper Cards mercenaries were also the only one with the most accurate numbers. This is good news. Then there was the commander of the lizard men, Hugel, who was at the pinnacle of silver rank, and Conrad was undoubtedly at the gold rank. As for the Earth Oracle accompanying the disciples of the Black Flames, Brando did not even want to mention it. However, Brando did not know that there was a Dark Oracle, or else he would have cursed out loud. He thought for a while and turned his head to see that the Silver Elves had already dealt with the white-haired egomaniac. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were treating their wounds with the help of their fellow mercenaries, the mercenaries of Lopez. Perhaps because of their similar backgrounds, the two groups got along very well. What do you plan to do? A voice sounded from beside him. Brando looked at the Silver Elf commander who was wearing a golden helmet and froze for a moment. If that human did not lie, the disciples of the Black Flames and the lizard men should be converging, and their speed should be about the same as ours. When we arrive, we will not only be facing a motley group of lizard men. The Silver Elf commander seemed to be explaining something that had nothing to do with him. That's basically correct, Brendel replied without thinking, but I'm guessing that Conrad has already met with the lizard men commander, Hugel, because he wants to prevent us from sneaking out from the north. The Silver Elf commander looked at him without saying a word. Although Brando and his subordinates were still incomparably powerful at this time, and it seemed like they could easily flatten the lizard men, he knew that this was far from the truth. He had never heard of an SSS-level mission that could be completed by pushing. They should have already sent out their spies. He thought we would run away. Brando smiled. But that's good, I want them to make a mistake. Brando's guess was not wrong. That evening, the lizard men dragon hunter cavalry spread out from their nest in Balagon. The next morning, the withered shrubs on the hillside rustled as a human hand and a slender elf hand separated them to the left and right. Behind the shrubs, Brendel and the Silver Elf commander calmly observed the movements in the valley. Brendel pondered for a moment before he spoke. Dragon Hunter Cavalry. This is the third group since yesterday. The Silver Elf commander's silver eyes reflected the scenery of the valley below, but there was no change in his expression. The Dragon Hunter cavalry's speed and agility in the forest surpassed any cavalry in this era, but it was still far inferior to the Myrna Shadow Knight. The Dragon Hunter cavalry leaped through the forest, its swift figure occasionally passing through the gaps between the canopy, but it was still a little too slow in the eyes of the Silver Elf Master Warrior. From this distance, it's already twice the patrol range of a bandit's nest. Even if it's under the tree herders, it's still not normal. Brando muttered to himself, looks like we've entered the storyline mode. What? The Silver Elf commander turned around. Nothing, the young man realized his slip of the tongue and quickly corrected himself, I'm just estimating the distance. That's unnecessary. The Silver Elf commander glanced at him. This was not the first time they had done something like this since last night. Brando quickly nodded. There's nothing to see, let's follow the original plan. He turned around and shouted, Sanford. The young man who was originally a Grey Wolves mercenary, but was now Brendel's subordinate, panted as he ran up from below. He looked up at the two people above and asked, Here. My lord, what's the matter? Even though he had just joined, Brando had already instructed Amandina to tell them his true identity. Of course, it was not a big deal for adventurers, travelers, or even merchants to use a fake identity, but these mercenaries were still happy that Brando trusted them so much. Compared to being a merchant, a future lord's identity was much more attractive to these mercenaries. Compared to a wandering life, these mercenaries were more willing to become a noble's follower. At least they could settle down. Especially from the description of the mercenaries of Lopez, it was obvious that this young lord was different from the other nobles who were opinionated and cold. Even though they had just learned a lesson from the famed Wolf Makarov, what could they do in this chaotic world? They could only work harder to gain the lord's attention. Pass down the order, get ready to move. Brando looked down at the valley below and replied. No problem, I'll go now. But halfway through, the young man turned back and asked with a puzzled expression, My lord, there's something I don't quite understand. Sanford hesitated for a moment, but still mustered up his courage to ask, I feel that with my lord's current strength, there's no need to go through so much trouble. We just need to kill our way through, and I believe that the lizard men will not be able to stop us. Even if they are in cahoots with the disciples of the Black Flames, it will still be the same. As far as I know, even if it's Erewhon. He did not finish his sentence. Even the royal family of Erewhon wouldn't be able to gather more than 20 temple knights. Although the total number of temple knights in Erewhon was more than 20, it was important to understand that not all of these temple knights were loyal to the nobles. Even if there were some who were loyal to a certain faction, not all of them were loyal to a certain faction. Sanford's words sounded like he was questioning Brando's identity, so he shut his mouth. But Brando still understood what he meant. He smiled and replied, You might be a little disappointed to hear this, because these elven allies are not my subordinates. They are fighting alongside us because they have the same goal as us. Another reason is that they cannot leave the area too far, or their strength will gradually weaken. The young man was stunned. He did not understand what Brando meant by their strength weakening. But he immediately replied loudly, No, my lord. You misunderstood, we will not be disappointed. Did you forget that when we pledged our loyalty to you yesterday, it was not because of your strength? It was because we wanted to repay you for helping us. So, no matter when, whether we are Grey Wolves mercenaries or former Grey Wolves mercenaries, we will not go back on our words. But he immediately asked, But these elven allies are temple knights, right? Even if their strength is weakened, is it really that strong? When he saw Sanford's expression, he knew that there was a problem with his understanding. Sanford could not be blamed. Indeed, according to normal people's understanding, even if a temple knight's strength was weakened by half, they would still be able to maintain their strength at the peak of the gold rank. 20 gold rank pinnacle warriors were indeed enough to sweep through this region. But things did not go as planned. There was something called the level system in this world. Reducing one's strength by half would only reduce one's level by 1 level, but reducing one's level by half would have a huge impact. Unfortunately, the damned altar system really did reduce their strength in such a way. The elven guards were level 60 normal units at their peak. With half of their strength deducted, they would become level 30 normal units. Not to mention that they were at the pinnacle of the gold tier, even silver tier would have a hard time maintaining their strength. 20 silver rankers could easily wipe out the lizard men, but the problem was that Conrad and the Angel of the Earth would be in big trouble. That was why he had to find a way to break through their strength. But it was difficult to explain, so he simply waved his hand and replied, don't worry, go and pass down the order. Trust me, I will bring you victory." The young man was stunned for a moment before he nodded. The elven commander watched Sanford's figure disappear into the forest. He then turned around and looked at Brando with his silver-gray eyes. "Human, I didn't expect you to be so arrogant." "It's confidence." Brando raised his head and corrected him. "Remember, this is not the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints. It is also not the era where all the talented commanders overshadowed all conventional tactics. Of course, perhaps in the near future, this continent will usher in that era again, but not now." He raised his head and looked at the forest in the north. "Now, in this place, I believe that no one has the ability to take victory away from me. I'm telling you this as a veteran commander. Commander, you can record it down." The elven commander looked at him and lowered his head to take off his golden helmet. When he raised his head again, he revealed a handsome and indifferent face. "To be honest, I don't understand." The other party replied as such. "You said that, perhaps in the near future, this continent will usher in that era again." The silver elf turned his face to the side. His cold profile was so beautiful that it would make any woman jealous. He asked, "You mean that the dark dragon will return to this continent?" "No, that's another matter." "Are you so sure, human? Can you see the future?" It was another cold question. Brando was stunned. How could this guy be so good at finding loopholes? The game development team might as well hire him to catch bugs. But he hesitated and said, "It's not foresight, it's a premonition. If you don't believe me, when the time comes, I will return to this place and tell you what happened in the outside world." He didn't know why he said this, but perhaps some secrets had been kept in his heart for too long. "This guy is just a ghost that can't leave this place," he thought. The elven commander paused for a moment, then smiled coldly. "Nalathar. Brando. Brando, then I'll wait to see your so-called victory." "This bastard, he still doesn't believe me." "As you wish." Brando gritted his teeth and replied. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 173. From Aekin's point of view, the silence in the valley was strange. In fact, he did not like the silence because danger always lurked in the calm. It was like a venomous snake hiding in the dark, ready to jump out and bite you. Aekin was a lizardmen dragoon hunting squad leader. Usually, the orders he received were straightforward and simple: attack or plunder, but dragoon hunting squads would occasionally act as scouts, which was one of the most annoying tasks for the lizardmen. Being a scout was too dangerous, especially in the forest. Professional skills were often more important than speed and agility. Aekin also did not like being unable to display his advantages. He raised his head, his long and narrow eyes reflecting the white-gold rays of the morning sun. The warmth of the sun dispelled the last trace of coldness from the night before. When the warmth seeped into the lizardman's cold blood, he could not help but shiver. The lizardman lieutenant shook its head in disgust. It used the unique nose structure of the lizardmen to track the unusual smell in the air. The order asked them to search for traces of a group of humans, but where were they? To the north of Chablis was a vast and boundless forest. To be honest, Aekin felt that finding a few people in the forest was a bit of a fantasy. But the lizardman lieutenant still carefully held on to his spear. His right hand pointed forward, with only 3 fingers pointing towards the forest in front of him. He made a series of high-pitched sounds, ordering his men to spread out and enter the forest. However, it didn't realize that it had made a mistake at this time. When Aekin sent his men into the strange forest and disappeared without a trace, he realized what was going on. But it was too late to react. The lizard man hurriedly retreated while trying to come up with an excuse to explain to Hugel, the leader of the lizard men, that his carelessness had cost the lives of 4 precious dragon hunters. This question was not easy to answer. Hugel was a vulgar and unsociable nouveau riche in the eyes of most of his men, but he was also a shrewd lizard man. Aekin knew that his leader was not easy to fool. How should he answer? However, it soon realized that it did not need to worry about this problem. When he turned around, he saw a human and an elf standing behind him. He had no idea when they appeared, but he knew that the elf was staring at him coldly. No, it should be a silver elf. Recently, they often went to the graveyard of the silver elf kings to cause trouble, so Aekin had learned something. That silver elf was emitting the aura of a peak gold rank expert. The outcome of the battle was predictable. It was hard to imagine how the 5 weak lizard men riders would be able to put up any resistance in front of more than 20 gold pinnacle warriors. Therefore, Aekin had no choice but to surrender. Sometimes, a small mistake could cost a person his life. However, the only thing that made the lizard man lieutenant happy was that the people who had captured him didn't seem to want to kill him for the time being. Unfortunately, this was only one of the many pieces of bad news that seemed easier to accept. As a scout, Aekin knew that the scouts would sometimes catch some of the captives and let them live a little longer before they got the information they wanted. But in the end, there was only one outcome. The scouts would not bring a burden with them. This sounded a bit strange, but it was the truth. Sometimes, death was not the most terrible thing. If you didn't tell the truth, the cold-hearted scouts had many ways to make you taste a taste worse than death. As a veteran scout and an even more experienced lizard man bandit, Aekin was not unfamiliar with what was going to happen next. However, it wasn't afraid because it was prepared to spill everything it knew as long as the other party interrogated it. Lizard men did not have any moral integrity. And as a bandit, the lizard men did not have any moral integrity. His hands and feet were tied tightly with a rope, but he still raised his head and carefully looked around. However, Aekin soon discovered a fact. If they wanted to catch some of the captives, they caught too few of them. The lizard man lieutenant saw that all of his subordinates were dead. For, no more, no less. He was not stupid and immediately realized that his survival situation might be a bit dangerous. Then who were they? What did they want? While Aekin was thinking about this question, his vision suddenly darkened. The 2 humans and the silver elf who had captured him before were standing in front of him. The lizard man lieutenant immediately swallowed his saliva and rolled his eyes. If he could survive, he was willing to do anything. But the key was how to save his life. While he was thinking about this profound question, Brando was also staring at him. Because the Amber Sword was not a game that played according to common sense, in fact, the players who had moved from PCs to next-generation home consoles gradually figured out this rule after a lot of losses. Of course, this experience was gradually passed down through the process of accumulation. After experiencing the virtual world, Brando naturally learned how to adapt to the way the cards were played in this world. He first stood in front of the lizard man lieutenant, carefully looked at him, and then smiled slightly. He squatted down in front of Aekin, stretched out his hand, and patted the lizardman's rough, narrow face, and said gently, "I know," he said, "you're thinking about what I'm going to ask, so you can tell me everything you know, and then beg me to spare your life, right?" Aekin opened his mouth wide, revealing about 100 sharp teeth. He now felt as if he was ready to fight any enemy, but he didn't expect to be punched in the face by his opponent. The lizard man shook his head. He couldn't figure out how this human knew what he was thinking. Or did he have the ability to read his mind? But if he had such an ability, didn't that mean that his only chance of survival was gone? Aekin couldn't help but tremble. He didn't ask for a chance of survival, he just hoped that these terrible enemies wouldn't torture him before he died. He couldn't help but stare at Brando vigilantly with his prismatic pupils. "Are you afraid?" Brando asked again. When he said this, he heard a low snicker behind him. He recognized that it was the voices of the Roman and Amandina, as well as the wild elf sisters. Then, most of the mercenaries of Lopez joined in. Brando couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. "Can't you see that I'm in the middle of something?" But he couldn't do anything about it. In fact, when he said this to the lizard man for the first time, everyone present was shocked. But after the second time, and even the third time, they realized that their lord was just pretending to be mysterious. Perhaps these people didn't understand that Brando didn't have the ability to read minds, nor was he pretending to be mysterious. He had dealt with these bandits and robbers too many times, and he already knew their basic reactions like the back of his hand. Brando already knew which NPCs had integrity and which ones didn't. The lizardman Aakin didn't have the time to care about others. He was terrified by Brando, and he was almost certain that this human was a wizard. A wizard who could see through people's hearts. Of course, he still had a trace of doubt, but he saw Brando stand up and take out a ruby from his chest. He pointed at the lizard man and asked, "You can try answering my question." Aakin was skeptical, but when he opened his mouth, he found that he couldn't make a sound. Even though his mouth was still opening and closing, there wasn't a single sound. This time, Aakin was really frightened. Even though wizards in this era were far less mysterious than they were in the Age of Chaos, the people in this remote mountain area still thought that these people held terrifying power. Aakin couldn't help but stare at Brando in a daze. He didn't understand why he stole his voice. But Brando held the ruby in his hand and dispelled the spell. He looked at the energy in the gemstone and saw that there were still 6 rounds left. Then, he put away the gemstone and said to the lizard man with a serious face, "See. I can take away your ability to speak, and I can also return it to you. Voice is a part of the soul. I can take away not only your voice, but also your soul." The young man's voice turned cold. "The body will rot, but the soul will live forever. Therefore, the punishment and pain of life are usually temporary. Have you ever tasted the taste of eternal torment in flames?" Aakin shivered and quickly shook his head. Brando smiled gently and crouched down to touch the lizardman's forehead. "Then can you do me a favor?" The lizardman nodded repeatedly. "You mean they retreated to the southwest?" "Yes, boss. My men saw them retreating to the southwest valley. I don't know if they have discovered us." Aakin pushed open the door and entered the hall that belonged to Hugel. He saw one of his comrades reporting something to their boss, who was sitting on a high chair in the middle. This scene made him nervous, but his survival instincts prevailed. He took a deep breath and sorted out his thoughts before walking forward. The lizard man who was reporting seemed to have finished what he wanted to say. Under Hugel's signal, he turned around and walked past Aakin and left the hall. The lizard man captain did not dare to look back or meet Hugel's gaze. He could only lower his head, but from the number of boots on the carpet, he could tell that there were 2 other people in the hall. In fact, he knew these 2 people. They were both humans, but they seemed to be friends with their boss. Aakin had seen them yesterday afternoon, but he knew that it was his boss's business and he didn't dare to ask. He recited what Brando told him in his heart. Oh, Martha above, he swore that he had never been so serious even when reciting prayers. The threat of that human wizard still lingered in his ears. It was a matter of life and death. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 174. At the same time, Conrad and the Dark Priest of the Black Flame Church were also sizing up the new lizard. But to their surprise, these low-level reptiles seemed to have the same face. At least in their eyes, this lizard and the previous lizard did not seem to be any different in appearance. Perhaps the pattern was different. On the other hand, Hugel recognized his subordinate and asked, "Ejin, you're back earlier than I expected. Did you find the target? Kujal didn't need to use the awkward Kurlut's language and was able to speak fluently. Yes, boss. Aekin lowered his head and replied fearfully. His attitude did not arouse Kujal's suspicion as he had always required his subordinates to treat him with respect. However, the bandit leader was a little impatient. He waved his hand and replied, "When did you become so hesitant, Aekin? What did you see this time?" "It's like this, boss." The lizard man captain swallowed his saliva and stammered, "My men and I were ambushed in the south and we lost some men. The ambushers seemed to be those humans. There were a total of 15 of them, 2 women and a young man leading them. They were very powerful and we did not even have time to react before we lost 4 of our brothers." South. Kujal was stunned as if he did not hear about the loss. "Are you sure it's south?" Aekin was startled as he thought that his boss would be furious. However, it quickly reacted and nodded. What did he say? Conrad was already impatient as he listened to the 2 lizard men chattering in their native language. When Kujal raised his voice, he knew that there was a problem. He immediately grabbed the lizardman's shoulder and asked. Kujal slapped his hand away and scolded, "This time it's the south." "That's great. Donald, is your opponent playing hide and seek with us?" "Southeast, south, southwest." The Dark Bishop was stunned. This does not make sense. There must be a conspiracy. Plot my ass. The lizard man bandit leader cursed. The current situation is very simple. The enemy has already discovered your presence. That bullshit young man you sent to bite down on the other side must have been killed by the other side. Those humans are fleeing towards the south. Split into 3 groups. They are trying to distract us. I have seen this kind of trick many times. Impossible. The Dark Bishop of the Black Fire sect almost jumped up. My oracle went with that guy. He excitedly took out a crystal from his robe with his withered claw. The crystal hasn't broken yet, which means that they are fine now. Then your foolish divine envoy must have gotten lost. Kujal coldly mocked. An oracle can get lost. Are you farting, stupid lizard? Conrad interrupted the lizard and turned back to stop the excited Dark Bishop. Why are you being so impulsive? He said angrily. From this point of view, the lizard was right. The other party had already discovered our intentions. They definitely won't run into us again. Escaping is inevitable, so we can't wait here any longer. Then what should we do? The Dark Bishop was stunned for a moment. Of course we chase after them. Which group? Kujal asked in an annoyed tone. Conrad looked at it coldly and replied indifferently, I said you're an idiot, and you're really an idiot. Are there only the 3 of us here? Where are your subordinates? Of course we will split into 3 groups. Are you afraid that a mere dozen silver-ranked guards will be able to defeat us one by one? Kujal was speechless. He opened his mouth but realized that the damned human was right. Then when do we set off? He asked in a weak tone. Of course, immediately. The Dark Bishop replied. No, Conrad stopped him, we will wait for you and my men to arrive. We will set off at night. You are too cautious, Conrad. This is not good. The low-ranking priest of the Disciples of the Black Flames had the same concern. After all, according to the report from the lizard men hunters, the enemy retreated a little too cautiously. Even so, the priest of the Disciples of the Black Flames muttered. Kujal glanced at the 2 of them and reminded them, don't forget that I have to take half of the credit for this matter. The 2 of them looked at the lizard man with a disdainful expression and snorted in disgust. They were not as shameless as him. However, none of the 3 big shots noticed that the lizard man Lieutenant Aekin, who had been keeping his head down the whole time, had secretly let out a sigh of relief. He thought to himself that this time, the terrifying wizard would finally return the soul that he had kept in captivity, right? What did the other party say? As long as he was not dead when the moon rose, it meant that his soul had returned to his body. Aekin could not help but feel apprehensive. That cunning wizard wouldn't go back on his words, right? He shuddered. Night quickly fell. Regardless of whether Aekin lost his soul when the moon rose, Conrad, Hugel, and the others began to move. A few miles away, from the top of the hill near the Silver Elves' ruins, one could see torches lit up in the ruins below. It looked like a sea of fire. In fact, such a scene was not common in the past, because it meant that the Lizardmen bandits were about to make a big move. They were gathering. However, it was not easy to gather the Lizardmen together, especially when one had to reorganize more than 1,000 Lizardmen who lacked the basic concept of left and right. It was an even bigger project. About an hour later, another long line of torches appeared from the west and entered the Balagon ruins. The dots of torches quickly gathered together, and the gathered torches seemed to illuminate the sky in that direction. At the same time, 4 figures stood silently on the mountain. The disciples of the Black Flames have gathered. Brando whispered as his eyes reflected the light of the fire. Conrad's men are here too. Sanford added. Brando nodded. Are you sure they will split into 3 groups, my lord? Sanford turned back and asked, what if they form a single group? What if they see through our tricks? There are no ifs. Brando thought to himself. How could there be ifs with his ability to lure the Lizardmen? If he was facing the elite army, especially the army led by the talented commanders of Madara, his little tricks might not work. However, the Lizardmen bandits would definitely not be able to guess his intentions. He had a huge advantage. He knew how strong the Lizardmen were, but the Lizardmen's understanding of him was still limited to the 12 silver-ranked guards that Rady had described. Under these circumstances, no matter if it was the Lizardmen commander or Conrad of the Paper Cards mercenaries, none of them would have thought that Brendel's plan was to take all of them, and take a large amount of EXP. Even if Brando told them himself that he wanted to use only a dozen silver-ranked warriors to wipe out 1,000-strong group of bandits, they would probably think that he had lost his mind. However, Brando paused for a moment and turned back to answer, even in the worst-case scenario, they will only form a single group. But that is still better than us killing our way here. Remember, they are the hunters, and we are the prey. In a hunt, the prey will always be the one deciding the direction, not the hunter. Sanford nodded in silence. The elven commander still stood at the side with a cold expression. At this distance, his strength was greatly limited. In truth, he could not see much more than Brando. The last person beside the 3 of them was the merchant girl. The Roman did not have the same direct understanding of the torches at the foot of the mountain. On the contrary, she felt that the torches were beautiful. They gathered together in the darkness and reflected in her eyes. It was like a painting made of flames, and she felt that it was exceptionally beautiful. However, Brando did not call her here just to see the fireworks. Soon, the torches began to scatter, and finally separated into 3 straight lines. My lord, you guessed it right. Sanford's eyes lit up as he exclaimed in excitement. However, his expression suddenly turned gloomy. Brando's confidence reminded him of Makarov. If there was one person who could always lead the Grey Wolves mercenaries forward, it would definitely be Makarov. But it was a pity that the so-called forever was just wishful thinking. Compared to Sanford's emotional fluctuation, Brando was not surprised at all. The drama had just begun. He pointed down and asked, Roman, can you see what the leaders look like? Sanford and the Silver Elf commander were stunned. How was that possible? They were at least 7 to 8 miles away from the ruins of the Silver Elves. Looking down from the top of the mountain, the torches were as dim as fireflies, not to mention the people holding the torches. However, they immediately realized that the young lady who was with them was not an ordinary person. The Roman immediately nodded and said, "Of course you can." There's a group of people on the left, and the one in front looks like a lizard, Brendel. That's the lizard man commander, Hugel. Continue. Brando glanced at the Roman. He knew the merchant girl's ability very well. The last time she was in Fortress Reden, she was able to see Madara's army clearly even in the starless night. Now, with the moonlight and the light from the torches, it was easy to see the enemy's appearance. Then there's the one in the middle, the leader is a human. He's a young man wearing leather armor. There seems to be a strange thing following him. The Roman described the strange thing in detail. Brando immediately said, "Conrad and the Angel of Earth." Strange, the two of them are together. Then who's the leader of the third group? The young Roman. Romaine nodded as her gaze fell upon the third group. She then described what she had seen to them. They're wearing long robes. Black with a few red stripes. "I can't see clearly, Brando." Brando muttered, "It's the Dark Bishop of the Blackfire Church. I didn't expect there to be such a person. It seems like the one who cursed Scarlet was him. I don't know how high his rank is, but according to Rady, he shouldn't be higher than the mid-ranked." "Then, my lord, should we continue with the original plan?" Sanford asked. That was a problem. Brando's original plan was to get rid of the Angel of Earth, but now that the Angel of Earth was with Conrad, it would be a tough battle. Of course, the tough battle was secondary. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to keep the Angel of Earth here. If he let the Angel of Earth escape, it would be troublesome. It was not impossible. The Angel of Earth was at least a LVL 50 boss, which was equivalent to a LVL 65 normal monster. In other words, the Angel of Earth was at least 5 levels higher than the silver elves under him. With the gold-ranked Conrad supporting them from the side, it wouldn't be easy to keep them here. Luring the Angel of Earth would only work once. The Angel of Earth was not an idiot who would fall into the same trap repeatedly. That was why he had to get the most out of it this time. Brando stroked his chin and felt a little troubled. What should he do? Killing the lizard men and the Dark Bishop didn't seem to affect him at all. But wait, the Dark Bishop. Another thought occurred to him at once, what the devil? That was the Dark Bishop. What was a Dark Bishop? Wasn't that a dark elementalist? Brando almost wanted to hit himself on the head. He felt that he was really an idiot. He didn't realize that killing the Dark Bishop would give him a lot of dark elemental crystals. Indeed, the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames was called a pauper by the players in the game because he would not drop anything other than dark elemental crystals when he died. Brando was influenced by his thoughts and forgot that the dark elemental crystals were what he needed now. Once he thought of this, the young man felt that his mind was suddenly opened up. Once the Dark Bishop was killed, the blood of gods in Scarlet would be temporarily suppressed because of the loss of control. Wouldn't that mean that he would have another powerful warrior in his hands? So he immediately clapped his hands and replied, "No, let's start with the Dark Bishop first." Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why the young lord's plan changed so suddenly. But Brando patted the head of his hunting dragon and made it turn around. At the same time, he smiled awkwardly and said, "Sometimes there will be some changes in the plan. This is normal. Don't worry, this won't affect anything. Anyway, let's go back to the ambush location. I don't plan to fight with them here." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 175. 4 hunting dragons traveled through the darkness, their faint shadows were like flowing water across the valley. The rider in the lead raised his hand high. The knights stopped abruptly, turned around in unison, and dismounted from their horses one after another. One of his hands was on the hilt of his sword, and his thigh crossed over a saddle made of some unknown leather. When his foot touched the ground, he heard Romaine's complaints as she shook her body on the back of the hunter dragon. "Brando, it's so uncomfortable to ride this thing." The merchant girl frowned and said with one hand on her neck, "It's not exciting at all." Brando smiled and walked over to help the girl down from the hunting dragon. He thought to himself, how can our Roman lady follow me obediently? The hunting dragon was a two-legged reptile. When it moved forward, its spine would twist in Anne's shape. If the rider did not undergo specialized training, it would be strange if they had a good time. Otherwise, why would he waste dozens of EXP to learn this skill from the lizard men captives? He had been tricked once in the game, so why would he step into the same trap again? But when the young man saw that his female companion's face was not looking good, he could not bear to see her like this. He replied gently, "You should go and rest. After all, the Roman would not be able to interfere in the upcoming battle." "Then I'll go to sleep." The Roman jumped down from his arm and winked at him. "I'll pray for you, Brando." "In a dream?" Brando asked impatiently. "Yes, in a dream." The girl nodded seriously. She smiled, and her bright eyes narrowed into an arc. She looked at him as if she had won a small victory. She turned around and ran past Lopez, who was walking out of the forest. Brando also smiled in his heart. He liked the merchant girl's optimistic attitude no matter what kind of adversity she was in. That night in Bucci, the Roman's first action had deeply attracted him. It was undeniable that he had inherited Brando's emotions, but the merchant girl had also conquered his modern side. He took a deep breath, and the cold night air immediately seeped into his lungs. His slightly feverish head gradually calmed down. When the young man saw the night-song tiger among the mercenaries, he paused for a moment before gesturing to the experienced mercenary leader. "Go back and prepare, the enemy is less than 5 miles away from us. Hurry up, there are more than 200 lizards. I want all the experience points left." Brando didn't like to talk too much before a battle. He had already made it clear that this was just a small ambush. Compared to the past in the game, it couldn't even compare to a slightly larger-scale team activity. Experience. Sanford dizzily jumped down from the hunting dragon's back and caught the phrase that he didn't understand. The night-song tiger glanced at the young man and pursed his lips. In fact, he was already used to the strange words that came out of his lord's mouth from time to time. Not only him, but those who had spent some time with Brando were already used to it and even learned a lot from him. "I'm talking about the enemy." Brando corrected himself with a straight face. The silver elf commander glanced at him and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Brando's order was quickly carried out. The group returned to the forest on the hillside and the young man began to arrange the battle strategy. Facing a group of level 20 enemies, Brando decided to use the most common method in the game, divide and conquer. He, the night-song tiger, and the silver elf commander hid in the forest and looked down at the silver elf guards and mercenaries. As the most professional warriors from the War of the Holy Saints, the silver elves' armor were all polished by experienced elven craftsmen, so there was no need to worry about it reflecting the moonlight. The mercenaries, on the other hand, were mostly wearing light leather armor. Even their chainmail was painted black, so there was no need to worry about it. The elves lined up behind the bushes and squatted down, holding their double-ended swords with one hand. Due to the same concern, their swords were also covered with dried leaves. About 30 feet behind them, the mercenaries were nervously holding their crossbows and crossbows, not daring to even breathe. In fact, Brando did not want to have any casualties in this battle, so he let the elven guards be the vanguard while the mercenaries were only responsible for suppressing the enemy from a distance. His subconscious action to reduce the number of casualties was seen by the new Grey Wolves mercenaries as an act of compassion for his subordinates. Although maned Wolf Makarov was able to bring them victory time and time again, as a noble commander, their common mistake was to treat the casualties of their subordinates as mere numbers. In Wond, whose productivity far exceeded that of Earth in the Middle Ages, manpower was always a number in the eyes of a commander. However, Brando was born in the game, and as a player, every NPC deployment was bought with real money. Some of them were even obtained from special missions. It could be said that every NPC deployment was not easy to obtain, so naturally, they would not be willing to sacrifice them like cannon fodder. Of course, Brando did not realize that his subconscious action had aroused the loyalty of the new Grey Wolves mercenaries. He only took out his pocket watch and estimated the time. At most, there was an hour left. He gently exhaled and shook his body to warm himself up in the cold forest before dawn. But he couldn't help but feel a little amused. It was just a small battle, but he actually felt a little nervous. Ever since he joined Grace's divine force to fight against Madara, he was always in command of 3 to 4 regiments. What kind of big battle had he not seen before? Even before he transmigrated to this world, he was still laughing at those timid newbies. He did not expect that one day, he would be acting like a newbie in his first battle. But even though he thought so, he could not help but feel his blood rushing through his veins when he looked through the forest that was bathed in white moonlight. This was not his first battle in this world, but it had been a long time since he hid in a forest all night just to wait for members of an enemy guild to pass by. He looked at the green numbers that were constantly changing in his vision. He knew that thing. In the game, they called it the distance calculation tool. It was used to calculate the casting distance and shooting distance penalty. But at this moment, it seemed so unreal. Brendel paused for a moment, and decided to familiarize himself with his stats. Strength 19. 4, plus 0, 1, Dexterity 10. 9, plus 1, 1, Vitality 21. 2, plus 2, Intelligence 1. 1, Will 3. 6, plus 1, Wisdom 3. 9, asterisk in brackets, equipment or other sources of attributes have been included in the total attributes. His attributes were infinitely close to the strength of a silver tier. Just one more level, and Brando was confident that he would be able to enter that realm. However, compared to his basic attributes, his skills were much stronger. In this life, he was in a much better situation compared to his previous life. The White Raven sword style and strength burst could be said to be one of the few skills that provided the greatest boost to a combatant in the early stages of the game. Brando could not imagine how he survived when he was only level 20 in his previous life by relying on a few basic skills. One must know that at this moment, with his experience and skills, it was easy for him to fight against enemies of the same level. He estimated his true strength. Even if he did not rely on his experience and skills, he could still reach the level of a silver tier. Of course, if he used his experience in the game, it would be impossible to measure. When facing different opponents, he might even be able to defeat a gold tier player. But for those who were difficult to deal with, sometimes experience and skills would not be of much use. Thinking of this, he suddenly turned around and asked, "Your battle skills came from the Sacred Land, right?" The Silver Elf commander was slightly stunned, and then looked at him with some vigilance. "Don't worry, I know your rules. I'm not interested in your elven battle skills, I'm just casually asking." Brando thought to himself. Of course I'm interested, it's just that I don't have enough reputation. Even if I tell you, you won't be able to learn it. The battle skills of the Silver Elves are tailor-made for my people, human. The Silver Elf turned around coldly. Brando despised the Silver Elf in his heart. He thought to himself that this guy who was as cold as an iceberg on the surface was also a hypocrite. If he did not know, it would be fine. Unfortunately, the Silver Elf commander probably did not know that he had learned the Silver Elf battle skills before, and more than one type. But of course, the young man would not say it out loud. He just smiled. "Don't be so heartless. You're called Nalathar, right? You've experienced the War of the Holy Saints." The Silver Elf glanced at him. He did not understand how the topic changed, but he still nodded. Then have you learned any dark battle skills? I don't. Nalathar answered firmly and coldly glanced at Brando. His lips moved, but he held back. In fact, there was only one type of silver elf that had learned dark battle skills, and that was the dark elf army under the dark dragon. Although he thought that Brando was deliberately mocking him, the silver elf commander thought for a moment and told himself that it was an unintentional mistake. Very few people in this era would know the secrets of that era. But Nalathar did not know that Brando was one of those few. Although he did not know if he was still considered human in his current state. After all, a person's body would not have two souls, and there would be some strange numbers on his retina. Nalathar was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "Do you really want to learn something, human?" This time, it was Brando's turn to be stunned. He opened his mouth and did not know how to answer. "You really want to teach? You're not playing with me, right?" Brando clearly remembered that the reputation of the Silver Elves was the hardest to raise. P.S. Previously, due to various reasons, I was not very supportive and did not have the face to ask for votes. Now that I've recovered, I can finally ask for some support. Everyone's support has really moved me to death. In just a few days, my monthly votes have increased by more than 400, and the number of friends who have tipped me has increased by 76. According to international practice, I should have a list to thank everyone, but I've never figured out how they did it. I have no choice but to thank everyone for their support. Although I can't list them one by one, I pay attention to each of them every day. Thank you again. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 176. You don't want to. Nalathar looked back at him, his eyes full of ridicule. Yes, of course I do. Brando quickly replied. Nonsense, who wouldn't want to learn the Elven Holy Land's battle techniques? Only an idiot. I can't teach you Elven battle techniques, so don't even think about it. Nalathar looked at him calmly and replied, Don't worry, I've already said that the Silver Elves' battle techniques are tailor-made for my people. Brando nodded, but he didn't think much of it, then. I can teach you something that we understand ourselves. The Silver Elf paused for a moment. You know, learning how to judge the strength of your enemies on the battlefield is very important. Wait. Brando took a deep breath and interrupted him. You said, inspect. The youth tried his best to calm himself down and asked. What a joke, that's an inspect skill. Looking at this cold silver elf now, he felt that she had become more amiable. After getting used to using numbers to measure strength, it was a little awkward for him to be like an NPC and use ranks to differentiate enemies. Moreover, without the inspect skill, there was no way to know what skills the enemy had. Of course, experience could provide some information, but it wasn't accurate for humanoid creatures. Brando wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could remember the skills of thousands of NPCs and their battle techniques. In the game, Martin should have taught him the inspect skill, but when Brando asked the veteran in Bragg's, he found that the veteran didn't know the skill at all. He thought for a moment. When he met the veteran in the game, it was already very late in the game, so it wasn't impossible for Martin to have learned the skill from someone else during that time. But after losing this clue, he found that it was unrealistic to find someone else to learn the skill. They were either too far away, or they were on the enemy's side. And now that Brando finally had a large amount of experience, he found that he had lost the opportunity to learn these skills. He had been worrying about this problem for a while now, and Nalathar had come knocking on his door. It had to be known that Identify was a skill that could be used to search others. It could see a character's basic stats and most commonly used skills. At higher levels, it could even evaluate a character's absolute strength. Using it to determine the strength of an enemy was far too easy. But when he looked hopefully at the Silver Elf, he saw the silver elf shake her head. Probing. Nalaethes replied, "The name we gave to this ability is deep analysis." What? Brando was stunned. What in-depth analysis? He had never heard of it before. He knew that there was an advanced version of inspect called Eagle Eye. This skill was so overpowered that not only did it have the same effect as inspect, but it also had a chance to steal skills from the enemies it killed. Unfortunately, Eagle Eye was Baron Bernargis's specialty, and the reputation required to teach this skill had to be at least ally rank. The problem was that this old man was Erwin's strongest opponent, the archenemy of Princess Griffin. In his previous life, how could Brando run over to him to farm reputation? Not to mention the price he would have to pay for doing so. He reckoned that his senior captain would have had a real-life PK with him first. Deep analysis. Nalaethes repeated, "This is actually a skill that every Silver Elf warrior knows. We use it to control the situation on the battlefield." Oh. Then what is it used for? Brando heard that this was a skill that every Silver Elf warrior knew, and his interest was piqued. As far as he knew, the Silver Elves were natural warriors. Their knowledge of battle and techniques was definitely not weak. The Silver Elf commander stared at Brando and replied, "I remember you said that you would bring victory to us. You even asked me to record this sentence. Then I will remember it. This skill is equivalent to a bet. If you keep your word, I will teach you this skill." He turned around and smiled when Brando did not notice. Damn. I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Brando cursed in his heart. But it didn't matter. Whether it was the victory of this battle or the skill, he was sure to obtain it. He wanted to know what kind of skill deep analysis was. After playing the game for more than 10 years in his previous life, there were very few skills in this game that he did not know. Of course, other than planeswalkers and cards of fate. At this time, he felt the Nightsong Tiger's elbow touch him. He raised his head and noticed that the mercenaries below had become restless. Although it was only for a moment, it was enough for him to sense that something was wrong. The long-awaited enemy had arrived. The first to enter the valley were the Lizardmen's dragon hunters. There were about 30 of them. Stepping on the cold rocks under the moonlight, they soon crossed the bottom of the valley. Then came a large number of Lizardmen infantry carrying spears and crossbows. Because they were not a regular army, these monsters did not have any neat equipment, nor did they have any flags. The division leaders wore armbands and commanded the troops nearby to maintain order. They were shouting and making unclear high-frequency calls so that the disorderly monsters would not scatter the formation too much. Because this place was still far from the place where the scouts had reported that they had encountered the humans, the lizard men did not spread out their formation. Instead, they maintained 2 or 3 rows as they passed through the valley. The mercenaries looked back at Brando and waited for him to give the order to attack. But Brando shook his head and told them to let go of the first half of the Lizardmen army. It was not the time to attack yet. Soon, the Dark Bishop entered the battlefield. Because he was not a physical class, he did not appear at the front or the sides of the formation. Instead, he was surrounded by a group of disciples of the Black Flames. Brando did not even need to think to know that they were all high-ranked disciples. He also saw a few tall one-armed demons walking in the middle of these disciples. They were Bacheza. Legend said that if a warrior's soul fell into hell, they would become a Bacheza demon. They were also one of the few low-ranked demons that had strong offensive abilities. The first half of the Lizardmen army had already been let go. Brando suddenly looked around and asked, "Where is Amandina?" Miss Amandina was called away by Miss Roman. The Nightsong Tiger replied. The young man replied with an "oh." He was still a little worried that Roman, that damned girl, would cause some trouble without anyone to control her. But when he heard that Amandina was with her, he felt a little more at ease. The only thing left was to deal with the upcoming battle. He stared at the valley. The lizard men did not notice the killing intent hidden on the hillside at all. The young man pulled out his sword. The blade was dark and did not reflect any light. He pointed the sword downwards. This was the signal to attack. The night's massacre began with the powerful vibrations of the four-armed crossbow strings. The mercenaries placed the handles of these weapons on their shoulders and aimed at their prey. They clenched their teeth and pulled the trigger. The metal wire quickly returned to its original state after losing its restraints. Clang, clang. A series of muffled sounds rang out. At the same time, a cloud of dust rose from the crossbow. At the same time, the elastic potential energy of the crossbow was transformed into a powerful kinetic energy. The battle had begun. From the lizardman's point of view, a dozen lines extended from the forest on one side of the slope, accompanied by a series of muffled noises. They only had time to turn their heads before they saw more than 10 of their comrades fall to the ground. They were all armed with crossbows. Although most of these lizard men were not killed by the crossbow bolts, the huge impact of the crossbow bolts still caused them to lose their ability to fight for a while. Ambush. The lizard men who had not fully evolved instinctively wanted to enter battle mode, but the second wave of attacks came as expected. The lizard men crossbowmen who were capable of long-range attacks were targeted one by one. Panic descended upon the lizard men like a calamity. The bushes on the hillside parted to the left and right, and a row of elven warriors wearing silver armor and wielding double-ended swords came out from behind. Although there were only 20 of them, they moved in an orderly manner as if they were still on the battlefield 7 centuries ago. Behind them was the army of the Silver Elf Empire, Heron. They were imposing. The low-ranking Dark Bishop of the Blackfire Church was shocked when he saw this scene. He thought that the lizardman's act of prying into the Silver Elf King's tomb had angered the ancient empire, causing this race that had been hidden for hundreds of years to reappear in this world. When the Silver Elf warriors appeared, he had the urge to kill that damned Hugel of the lizard men. What a joke! They were the Silver Elves who had won the War of the Holy Saints. The Dark Bishop felt his hands tremble when he saw 20 gold-ranked warriors. He hoped that the lizard men cannon fodder below could buy him some time, but it seemed that the situation would only get worse. When the first group of Silver Elves charged into the lizard men, the huge impact threw the skinny lizard men into the air. Even if they did not die, they would be heavily injured. The fully armed elven heavy infantry directly opened up a path among the lizard men and trampled over the lizard men who had yet to get up. The battle was not constructive. Although the lizard men outnumbered the Silver Elves by 10 to 1, it was a one-sided slaughter for the Gold Elves against the Iron Elves. When the elven guards charged forward, the mercenaries were reloading their crossbows for the third round of arrows. At this time, Brando, the Nightsong Tiger and the Silver Elf commander also charged forward. The fastest of the three was undoubtedly Brando. The young man noticed that something was amiss from the start of the battle. Of course, it was not bad news. On the contrary, he noticed that his experience points were increasing rapidly. Logically speaking, although the mercenaries of Lopez and the Grey Wolves mercenaries were his summoned creatures and subordinates, the Silver Elves were the ones who dealt the most damage. These elves were his allies. In other words, they were in a party. Logically speaking, with so many high-level characters, the Silver Elves were level 40 at this time, the amount of experience points he could share should be very little. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 177. But after a short pause, he finally realized what was going on. Holy shit, a perfect story with bonus EXP. So there really is such a thing. He could no longer sit still and activated his charge skill. Like a blur, he passed by the Nightsong Tiger, the elven commander, the mercenaries, and the elven guards and stopped in front of a row of lizardmen spearmen. He raised his head and saw a row of lizardmen soldiers approaching him. Good timing. Brando shouted in his mind. He raised his sword and blocked the 2 spears that were coming at him with a clang. Even though he was level 24, his combat power was far beyond that of a normal level 30 NPC. The lizardmen spearmen were level 19 monsters, and they were no match for him. Brando did not even need to look at the enemy's appearance. He immediately used Strength Burst, and the 2 lizardmen spearmen screamed and flew backward. The young man took another step forward and pulled the sword from right to left with both hands. The wind pressure seemed to have dislocated the space in an instant, and a 7-meter-long transparent ripple whizzed across the upper half of the lizardmen's bodies. It was like the scenery he saw in the mountains of Grimoires, where the wind blew through the mountain meadows, causing the grass to fall back. A number appeared in his vision, and the lizardmen in front of him were split into 2 and fell backward. The scene was similar to the time when Metasha was chasing after him and the Nightsong Tiger, and the entire battlefield was silent. Wind pressure could be used to injure people outside of elemental activation, and only a few combat skills could do that. Metasha's Spirit Spear was actually a skill derived from the Ghost Knight, and the average elven warrior would not be able to use it. Even a lower gold elven warrior would not be able to use it. Only when they were at their peak and had activated their elemental activation would they be able to use it. Brando sheathed his sword and let out a sigh of relief. He had only killed 6 or 7 lizard men with his sword, but the impact was huge. He saw the morale value above the heads of the lizard men warriors close to him drop to a red alert value. Then, one after another, the lizard men warriors circled around him, forming a vacuum around him. This gave Brando time to check his experience points. He found that the 7 lizard men spearmen he had killed before had given him 60 experience points each. Normally, killing a level 19 monster would only give him a little more than 20 experience points. This was close to 3 times the amount he had gained in the game. Brando felt his blood boiling. He was already at 32007900 EXP, and he was only halfway to level 25. When the Silver Elves crashed into the group of lizard men, his experience had increased by more than 200 points. In addition, the 7 lizard men had given him 420 experience points. He estimated that if he killed another 20 to 30 lizard men, wouldn't he be able to level up? Level 25 was a watershed. Not only could he obtain a second talent, but he could also obtain a third-class skill that came with it. Moreover, once he reached level 25, he would have the strength of a silver tier. At the age of 19, he had the strength of a silver tier. This was already the standard of an enlightened one. I don't have to feel inferior when I see a genius anymore, right? Even though I've never felt inferior before, but I can't help but feel a little annoyed when I see geniuses running rampant in this era. Moreover, if a level 19 lizardman spearman gave 60 experience points, then what about a level 22 lizardman crossbowman and a level 23 elite lizardman warrior? Not to mention a level 25 dragon knight, a disciple of the Black Flame, and that dark bishop. When Brando thought of the dark bishop, he couldn't help but feel his blood boil. His eyes turned red, and he couldn't help but look around, trying to find where the experience points were. However, the first thing Brando saw was a group of high-grade disciples of the Black Flame surging forward like a tidal wave. He immediately realized that the Dark Bishop didn't want them to break through the center of the formation and split the Lizard Men army into 2. This was because the Dark Bishop knew that once the Lizard Men army was split, it would be difficult to protect both the front and the back. Unless he had the determination to cut off his losses, it would be useless. He was a spellcaster, and he needed to rely on protection to escape from this chaotic battlefield. He had no choice but to move his high-grade disciples of the Black Flame to the center to stabilize the defensive line. More than 10 disciples of the Black Flame Knights wearing black robes and riding on lesser demons waved their flails as they charged forward. Unfortunately, at this time, the silver elves in silver armor had already rushed forward and stood side by side with Brando. The surrounding lizard men who wanted to surround them were continuously attacked by the mercenaries. If the dark bishop who commanded all of this was a little calmer, he would be able to command the lizard men to give up on protecting him and attack Brando's long-range formation. The situation would probably be better. Unfortunately, the art of command was not the dark bishop's specialty, and he could only subconsciously order the lizard men and disciples of the Black Flame to stay close to him. On one hand, he wanted to avoid being separated, and on the other hand, he wanted to protect himself better. He had to start preparing his spells. Unfortunately, Brando's reaction was faster than his. The sounds of battle in the valley had already become one. Amandina couldn't help but shiver when the wind swept across the bare cliffs without any vegetation. She felt as if the bottom of the mountain was in another world. She coughed lightly and used her hands to wrap the shawl around her body. The noble lady stood alone outside the cliff. She looked around fearfully, then frowned and looked worriedly into the deep crevice. After hesitating for a long time, she asked in a soft voice, "What's the matter?" "Roman, is it not done yet?" "It's almost done." Romaine's matter-of-fact voice came from inside. Amandina sighed. She had already heard this answer several times, but she knew that Romaine would definitely ignore her complaints. She could only stomp her feet to dispel the chill in her body. But this time, Roman seemed to be almost done. She walked along the crevice for a while without relying on any light source, as if the darkness was a dear friend to her. However, most ordinary people would subconsciously feel afraid in such a narrow and dark environment. This young lady, on the other hand, looked very interested. She then took out a piece of crystal from her pocket, bent down and rummaged under the gravel for a while, and put the crystal in. She turned around and counted with her fingers. She seriously counted around 5 similar places, nodded, and calmly retreated. As soon as she walked out of the crevice, she saw Amandina's frown and resentful eyes. "I regret it, Roman. Let's go back." Amandina lowered her head and coughed. "Don't worry, it's just an experiment. Brando won't find out." Roman's face was full of pride. She grabbed Amandina's hand and walked forward. "Let's go to the next place." Wait, give me some more of that, Amandina." "What are you doing?" Amandina hurriedly covered her bag. She was already unlucky enough to let this girl discover her secret, and she did not want to go crazy with this merchant girl. "Is there a problem with the calculations?" "Of course." Amandina gritted her teeth and replied, "Roman, you despicable woman. I was once an honorary student of the Royal Geographical Society of Lantan Island." Amandina immediately sighed in disappointment. A wind bullet, a fireball. When the swollen and hot air dispersed from the battlefield, the dozen or so high-ranking disciples of the Black Flame sect had already turned into ashes. As an explosive magic item, the Ring of the Wind Empress's energy was 20 OZ, and damage was 30. It was almost equivalent to the peak of Iron rank, and its impact was close to that of a lower Silver rank. The fireball's energy was 24 OZ, and damage was 70. It was equivalent to a lower Silver rank, and the area of effect was around the middle of the Silver rank. It was normal for the disciples of the Black Flames to be killed by a combo attack. Brando was worried that there would be troublesome high-ranked disciples like the Lord of Spiked Chains on the battlefield, but it seemed that his worry was unnecessary. The Lord of Spiked Chains was an elite among low-ranked demons, and it was impossible for a large number of them to appear in this world. Unless the demonic gate reopened. After the smoke cleared, Brando's experience increased by almost 2,000 points. He was only one step away from level 25. He immediately put down his sword and ordered the silver elves beside him, attack the left and right sides, and separate the lizard men. The boss in the middle, no, I mean their leader, leave it to me. Do you understand? The 20 silver elves nodded in unison. What about me, my lord? The Night Song Tiger asked. You and Nalathar will lead one side each. Brando replied. You don't need help. The Silver Elven commander rarely spoke. Leave it to me. I don't want that guy to die so quickly. Brando replied, but he had other thoughts in his mind. Even though the low-ranked Dark Bishop was called a pauper, he was still a level 25 elite creature. His strength was equivalent to a level 35 unit. Of course, the only difference was that it would be difficult for him to deal with a level 35 creature, but it would be much easier for him to deal with a level 25 elite creature. Moreover, that was a sizable amount of experience. The young man did not give the other two a chance to refute and went for the kill alone. In front of him were two Bacheza demons that were almost 3 meters tall. These creatures were very strong because they had the ability to charge. It could be said that they were a nightmare for low-ranked archers and wizards. Unfortunately, Brando was neither an archer nor a wizard, but a warrior. He rushed in front of the two demons, and before they could raise their swords and land a heavy blow on his head, he had already circled behind them like a ghost. The Bacheza demon was a level 24 creature. Its strength was 14 ounces, but its dexterity was a pitiful 7 ounces, which was almost half of Brando's when he was in his berserk state. The only thing it could be proud of was its thick skin and charge ability. In front of the young man, Brando's sword cut open a hole in its back, and then once again followed the movement of the clumsy creature and flashed behind it. Once again, he was behind it, and then another strike. This pitiful Bacheza demon was almost tortured to death in humiliation. Even until its blood ran dry, it did not see what its enemy looked like. At this time, the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames finally finished preparing his spell. He screamed and threw a black lightning at Brando. This thing was not as simple as lightning. Brando knew that this spell was called Demon's Claw. This was actually a 2D spell. Its main effect was to cause damage. It used the dark element to transform into hellfire damage. Then there was the following deceleration. As a level 3 spell, this deceleration was not as simple as Ice Break Arrow. On the contrary, it would firmly fix the person to the ground. If your strength did not exceed 40 ounces, then you would have to be prepared to be beaten within a minute and a half. This spell could be said to be one of the most practical early-stage spells for dark elementalists, evil priests, and witches. It was especially useful for sneak attacks. Unfortunately, Brando wanted to tell the Dark Bishop that this spell was not meant to be used like this. Although in the early stages of the game, most players like to cast spells in such a crude way without any modification. But in fact, the best way to use this spell was to use a light-bending spell to hide all of its light effects, or simply use it at close range. This was because this demon's claw needed to be aimed. Brendel swung his sword and sent the Bacheza demon's corpse flying, blocking the snake-like black lightning in midair. The lightning struck the Bacheza demon's body and immediately exploded into tens of thousands of black electric arcs that swept across the two sides of the cold corpse, locking it to the ground. The whole process was as black as ink, and the scene was spectacular. Unfortunately, the spell's effect was 0 against the real target. At this moment, Brando had already raised his long sword. Strength burst, and the Ghost Knight's crystal's 30-ounce strength directly sent the remaining Bacheza demon's head and arm flying into the air. He took a deep breath. Even though strength burst was powerful, it also consumed a lot of stamina. Fortunately, when the ball of light from the demon entered his body, a warm current immediately flowed from his heart to his limbs and bones. A row of green words immediately appeared on the young man's retina. Character has reached level 25, entering the stage of activating fate. Character has obtained the skill Frontal Breakthrough, level 0, consume 5 times stamina to break the opponent's defense, armor, innate, magic, in the next attack, reducing 1/7 damage immunity. Detected a fate item Golden Truth of Fate nearby. Do you wish to activate the Fate talent, Golden Revelation? Brando was stunned. What kind of joke was this? He hurriedly shook his head. No, I refuse to activate it. P.S. Corrected a mistake. First, it was mentioned in the previous chapter that the main character was level 23, but he was actually level 24. I forgot to check his stats when writing, so now I have to correct it. Thus, Brando will be able to activate the Fate talent at level 25. Also, when I arrived at my uncle's house, I thought that I wouldn't be able to write 3 chapters today, but in the end, I still managed to write it. 233. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are even more chapters. Chapter 178. The Golden Apple was one of the mythical special items in the past. The golden apocalypse that was born from it was the leaf of the golden tree. This golden tree was not the useless golden demonic tree that Brando had encountered. The real golden tree was actually a special name that referred to the world tree, Mana, that grew on the banks of the Abyss Lake and under the world's summit. Mana could indeed be said to be one of the origins of the golden bloodline in this world of wound. The talent that was bestowed by its leaf was a 10% increase in all attributes and a tenfold increase in mental strength. Even in Brando's previous life, the young people only knew of a few top elementalists who had such a talent through quests. If it was in the past, he would only fantasize about the golden apple in his dreams. But at this moment, such an opportunity was in front of him, almost within reach. All he had to do was nod his head, and from then on, his strength, constitution, dexterity, willpower, and perception growth from all classes would be increased by 10%. Furthermore, the tenfold increase in spiritual power meant that his mana pool would be doubled. At the same time, the number of spells that could be chanted at the same time would be increased by 3. This talent could be said to be a blessing for all spellcasting classes, especially for elementalists who were close to the elements of nature. That was why it had another name, fairy language. This talent was unanimously rated as S+ on authoritative analysis websites, although it was slightly inferior to Brando's current warrior class. But the latter also understood that he would eventually have to take on the elementalist class to complete the deck that he had set for himself, the tyrant of all classes planeswalker. Coupled with the characteristic of this talent that increased all attributes, it seemed to be particularly suitable for him. But he did not hesitate for a moment and firmly shook his head. Although the golden leaf was good, it was still different from his previous life. Brando deeply understood that in this world, he only had one chance. Once he made a decision, there was no room for regret. What he wanted could only be the best, or the talent that was most in line with his plan. In his previous life, he might not have such a choice, but it was different here. After losing the competition of other players, Brando understood that now there were many opportunities in front of him. And the golden leaf was just one of them that looked better. He had 2 goals, one of them was a primordial being, which increased all stats by 10% and reduced the penalty for subclasses by 50%. This was an S- grade talent, but the latter attribute was simply too important for him, who didn't know how many professions he would take on in the future. It could even be said that it was precious. The second one was the legendary Twin Union. This destiny talent could be said to be one of the most legendary talents in the Amber Sword in the past. It was different from the other talents that were rated S and above. This S-rank talent only had one attribute. However, with just this attribute alone, it was enough to stand out from the many A-grade talents. The attribute of the Twin Pact was that it would increase the user's profession by 1 exclusive ability. Ancient Battle Skills. Any battle skill possessed by a warrior will have its maximum mastery increased by 1 level. Ancient Battle Skills. Any battle skill possessed by a warrior will have its maximum mastery increased by 1 level. In the past, a skill from level 1 to level 5 was called Beginner, level 5 to level 10 was Advanced, and after level 10 was expert. Most non-specialized skills would be upgraded to level 15 when they reached the peak of expert. Only specialized skills could be upgraded to level 15, which would be Master and Grandmaster. After elemental activation, skills that reached Grandmaster could be further upgraded with elemental points, but it would stop at the Ancient Sacred Land stage. However, there was only one way for a warrior to upgrade a skill to Legendary, and that was through the exclusive ability provided by the Twin Pact. However, once a skill reached Legendary, even an intermediate skill would be comparable to an advanced skill. Therefore, there were also people who hypothesized that a character with both advanced skills and Twin Pact talents would have an advanced skill after Legendary. However, this was ultimately just a hypothesis, because advanced skills and Twin Pact were both unattainable. Even a RMB warrior would not be able to win against them. At this time, they could only rely on the strongest force among the players, the face fighter. However, to be able to use the Twin Pact and possess advanced skills, and the advanced skill had to be compatible with his own elemental activation, only then could he invest elemental points into it. A person with such a good face would have probably traveled to another world to conquer the world. Therefore, Brando had never seen such a person before. And because the Twin Pact was so rare and powerful, it was often called a pseudo-SS talent for fate by players who liked to take on more than 10 professions. It could be said that above the Twin Union, there were only a few SS talents that were crowned with powerful titles such as Son of Marcia and Calamity of the Azure. These talents only existed in rumors and had never appeared before. I'm not a greedy person. I don't wish for things that I've never seen before, even though I suspect that they are made up by the players. But to me, the Twin Union, or even the Primordial Era, is more than enough. Moreover, he also had a way to obtain these two talents. After all, as long as someone obtained them before, he could copy them and complete them again. Of course, the golden leaf was definitely not enough. He would definitely not use up his one and only chance to choose something that was not suitable for him because of impatience. Previously, when he was in Butchie, he chose the Indomitable talent because it was a matter of life and death. Thinking about it now, he regretted it for a long time. After all, if he had chosen the Descendant of the Dragon or the Will of the Bloodline, his battle strength would have increased by at least 20% to 30%. I refuse to use it, Brando replied in his heart. At the same time, he changed his direction and dodged a pure dark magic arrow that the Dark Bishop threw at him. To be honest, if this spell hit the current Brando, it would only break one or two of his bones. Moreover, with the nimbleness of a young man, the Dark Bishop did not even need to look to know that he would not be able to hit the target. However, both sides knew that the advantage of the magic arrow was that it was very fast and did not require any chanting time. The Dark Bishop only wanted to use this low circle spell to force Brando to change his direction and prevent him from getting too close to him. The disciples of the Black Flames who were originally scattered around the Dark Bishop were all either dead or injured. The only ones left were a dozen or so trembling lizardmen warriors. The Dark Bishop knew that these things were useless against Brando. He could only grit his teeth and rely on his own strength, even though the situation seemed to be unchangeable. As he threw the second magic arrow, he cursed the lizardmen warriors in his heart. How did the 20 silver elves kill their way out? In fact, until now, he still did not realize that he had been tricked from the start. Brando was not in a hurry. He thought to himself, if you were 5 levels higher and advanced to an elven envoy, obtained the exclusive passive skill, Spirit Pulse, and learned Dual Chant, then you would be casting magic arrows while charging up for other spells. I reckon I would have to worry about that. But what's the use of constantly using low-level spells to exhaust my physical strength? Could it be that your magic power is more abundant than my physical strength? At the same time, the young man noticed that the green option on his retina was fading away, and soon another message appeared, detected that the character has reached level 25, the Bloodline talent has been unlocked for the second time. Unyielding, LV, 2-player gains elemental resistance +5, physical damage reduction +5%. Brando was speechless when he saw the tanking talent. He simply erased the message so that it would not disturb his battle mood. To be honest, this talent was one of the stronger ones among the tanking talents. It was a pity that the warriors in The Amber Sword never appeared as tanks, let alone mercenaries with more diverse attacks. He had chosen this talent in a hurry, and now it seemed that this message was a bit sarcastic. Who would stick their face up to a monster for no reason? The Silver Elf guards were now chasing the lizard men up the hills on both sides, and the Dark Bishop seemed to have realized his mistake. Brando suddenly felt that the magic arrow that had been chasing him had stopped. He looked back and saw that the Dark Bishop was surrounded by black smoke. It was obvious that he was chanting and gathering the dark elements, preparing to cast a high circle spell. But Brando would not give him the chance. He was not a rookie who had participated in a boss battle for the first time, and it would take him a long time to figure out the boss intentions. The young man swung his sword behind him, and a wind pressure blew away a few fish that had escaped the net. At the same time, he activated charge, and his whole body turned into a straight line. The lizardmen warriors around the Dark Bishop did not even have time to react before Brando had already passed through them and reached the Dark Bishop of the Blackfire sect. He raised his sword and slashed with all his strength. It was as if there was a sudden flash of black light, and the long sword that was buffed by power burst crashed into a pitch-black barrier that suddenly appeared. Ha! Brando was slightly startled, and then he saw the Dark Bishop's withered claws reach out of his robe, and a large shield surrounded by a dim light appeared in front of him. The person whose face was hidden under the hood gave him a sinister smile. He pointed his finger forward, and a black flame suddenly shot out. Magic arrow. P.S. Yesterday, someone in the book review section pointed out that Brando's stats were wrong. I checked and found that it was indeed the case. I did not include the strength bonus from the Necklace of the Lesser Ghouls. This was my oversight, and I apologize to everyone. There shouldn't be any problems with the rest. As for the growth of experience, it is not a linear growth, but in reality, every profession's stats are the same. Finally, I'm going to complain. The people who urge me to update are so despicable. I curse you all to be on the 8th floor. Chapter 179. Magic Arrow. Brendel gritted his teeth and dodged to the side, allowing the flames to graze past his chest. His skin immediately felt like it was on fire, and he knew that it was caused by the corrosion of the dark element. But at least it was better than breaking 2 of his ribs. He sighed in relief. He had forgotten that the Dark Bishop's camouflage skill was very high. Even though he had been guarding against it, he still could not avoid it completely. In the past, the Knight and Judge classes were the ones who took the hit. However, Brando believed in his reflexes, and it did not disappoint him. If he had been hit by the Dark Bishop's camouflage skill, he would have been hit by a combination of spells. Even though he would not be killed, he would not be able to survive for a day or two. More importantly, the Night Song Tiger and the others would probably stop him if he had the chance to gain EXP alone in the future. Fortunately, it was as he had expected. Since the Dark Bishop's camouflage plan did not work, it was time for him to counterattack. Brando's figure flashed, and he was already behind the Dark Bishop. Another slash. The Dark Bishop waved his hand behind him, and the black shield of light that was in front of him immediately circled around to meet Brendel's sword. At the same time, a ball of black flames appeared in his left hand. Brando snorted. The Dark Bishop's submerged light shield only had a hardness of 10, and his previous slash had already destroyed 13% of it. However, the Dark Bishop seemed to think that he would need at least 3 slashes to break through the Dark Bishop's submerged light shield. He was not in a hurry, and he jumped back to avoid the Dark Bishop's second magic arrow. At this moment, the two of them exchanged blows in the blink of an eye. At the same time, the lizard-men warriors realized that they had lost sight of Brando. They were startled for a moment before they turned around. However, the first thing they saw was this: the Dark Bishop took a step back, and after dodging the black flame, he immediately attacked again. His sword was glowing. As Brando retreated, he called out his attribute panel and raised his new skill to level 5. After Direct Breakthrough had reached level 5, the damage reduction effect had increased to 10%. In fact, this skill was the nemesis of all heavy armor warriors and boundary wizards, not to mention the Shield of Oblivion of a mere dark elementalist. After the sword began to vibrate at a high frequency, the blade reflected the moonlight and looked like it was coated with a layer of fluorescent light from afar. The Dark Bishop's sword. Brando's Direct Breakthrough. He felt as if half of his strength was used up to half of his strength. But the result didn't disappoint him. The Dark Bishop couldn't believe his eyes as his Shield of Oblivion turned into black fragments. Then, that simple-looking sword went down and cut into his abdomen. Brando immediately let go of his sword and flashed behind the Dark Bishop. As soon as he moved, the Dark Bishop howled. Large amounts of black flames shot out from his eyes, nostrils, mouth, and wounds. These flames were much more beautiful than the magic arrow's flames, at least 10 times more. Even though Brando was standing behind the Dark Bishop, he could still feel the dark elemental energy in the air, which made his skin tingle. Burning half of one's HP to activate the elemental energy in an instant was the last resort of every elementalist. However, only the Dark Bishop of the Black Flame sect was so crazy that he dared to use this spell even though he knew that he had lost more than half of his HP. He wanted to take him down with him. If Brando had not been at a disadvantage like this before, he would have been hit by this spell if he was not careful. Even if he did not die, he would have at least lost a layer of skin. However, no matter what, his white longsword had been destroyed. Unless it was a magic item, very few ordinary items could survive the dark elemental energy. Brando was not sure how much of the sword was left behind, and he did not intend to look at it anyway. He turned around and smiled at the lizard men who were about to surround him. Brando thought that his smile was amiable, but to the lizard men, it was like a devil's smile. They had seen how strong the Dark Bishop was, but he was killed by this young man in the blink of an eye. They were just small fries, what else could they do? The lizard men warriors could not help but look at each other, and then they simply turned around and ran. As a group of bandits, this was in line with their nature. In their eyes, the only thing worth rejoicing about was that the young man did not intend to chase after them. Of course, what they did not know was that Brando was currently in a state of exhaustion. In the last attack, he had used both Strength Burst and Frontal Assault at the same time. It was important to note that the consumption of skills was multiplied and not added. In other words, in an instant, he had used up 15 times his normal stamina. Although it was not to the extent that he had used up all his stamina, it was normal for him to be exhausted after using up so much stamina. Anyway, the battle was coming to an end. He first checked his EXP. Killing the Dark Bishop had given him a total of 4,200 EXP. Even though he had just leveled up, his EXP bar was already at 564513600, and it was still rapidly increasing. He looked up and saw that the Silver Elves had completely separated the lizard men from both sides and were herding them up the narrow and complicated slope. After the Dark Bishop was killed, the lizard men were almost unable to form a counterattack. They began to retreat. At first, they were able to maintain their formation, but it gradually turned into a mass exodus. The only thing left was to harvest the EXP. Brando simply sat down beside the Dark Bishop's corpse and did not touch the Dark Bishop's corpse. He was well aware of how unlucky he was, so he decided to wait for the Elementalist sisters to open it. He took out a fluorescent crystal from his bosom, lit it up and threw it out. This was a signal that he no longer needed the mercenaries' long-range support, so he decided to let them come down first. But this period of waiting made him feel a little bored. Bored to death, Brando looked at his own attributes. Strength and vitality had both reached 25 ounces, and dexterity had also increased by 3 ounces. He could not help but clench his right hand. This is the strength of a silver. Although it is still a lower tier. But in terms of combat ability, it is already close to an upper tier. Only 2 months. Can you believe it, Brando? You went from a mediocre militia to a silver-ranked knight. The guards that you once yearned for are nothing now. Trust me, we still have a long way to go. Brendel could not help but smile, one hand pressed against his chest, and said to himself in his heart. He was a little emotional, but he knew that this emotion came from the side of him that belonged to this world. Because to Sophie, level 25 was really nothing. He raised his head and saw the mercenaries coming out of the forest one after another. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were obviously more excited than the Nightsong Tiger and the others because they did not know much about their lord. Although Brando said that he would bring them victory, they only realized how easy it was when victory was in their hands. There were no casualties. Even if they had more than 20 gold-tier elven warriors as their allies, it was still a battle of 30 against 200. Not to mention, there were also disciples of the Black Flames sect, a silver-tier demon, and the Dark Bishop who had given them nightmares. Sanford was even a little excited when he ran to Brando's side. He could not help but ask in a rude manner, "My lord, you broke through?" Brando nodded. A silver ranked at 20 years old. Sanford and the other Grey Wolves mercenaries looked at each other and could not help but sigh. We are so lucky to be able to witness the birth of 2 geniuses. 2. There's another one who used to be a member of our mercenary group. His name is Eek. So it's him. Brando raised his eyebrows. However, that wasn't his concern. His gaze scanned the mercenaries and finally landed on the 2 wild elf sisters who were walking at the back. He immediately waved his hand. "Come, red hand soft sister, help me open up the corpse." Everyone was stunned when they heard Roland's words. Everyone followed Brando's gaze and hesitated for a long time before it finally landed on the elder wild elf sister. The girl was slightly stunned. She looked at the others and hesitantly pointed at herself. "Me. Of course, didn't I say it before?" Brendel pointed to the Dark Bishop's corpse and said, "You're going to open the corpse." "No, I mean, sort out the loot." The wild elf girl frowned and bit her lips. She glared at Brando and said, "My lord, my name is Falerne, not some red hand soft sister." She was so used to speaking the elven language that she almost had to bite her own tongue before she managed to say it out loud. She then looked at Brendel coldly, thinking that this guy was always causing trouble for her. Brando coughed and explained, "All right, Falerne. In fact, red hand soft sister is a compliment in my hometown." However, he immediately noticed that Falerne was looking at him suspiciously. "My lord, I've also been to Karsuk, but the locals don't seem to have such a saying." Sanford whispered. "No, it's just a slang between wizards." Brando reacted quickly. "Then what does it mean?" "It means that a person is very lucky, very soft, and is a girl." Even though she didn't know what "very soft" meant, the elder wild elf girl understood what it meant. She couldn't help but glance at her lord, secretly disdainful, thinking that humans were indeed frivolous fellows. However, considering the relationship between her sister and Brando, Falerne didn't give him a hard time. She nodded and planned to do as he said. But at that moment, everyone heard a series of muffled sounds coming from the east side of the valley. At first, it was a low rumbling sound, then it gradually turned into the sound of something breaking from within. The continuous rumbling sound seemed to come from the ground, and the ground they were standing on trembled. Brando saw that the stones on the ground seemed to have come alive, or rather, they seemed to have been injected with magic and started dancing. He subconsciously looked at his feet. Suddenly, he realized that the sound was familiar. It sounded like the disintegration crystals that appeared in the early stages of the Second War of the Black Rose. Speaking of which, he hadn't heard this sound in the game for at least a few decades. It was really familiar, but wait. Brando's expression suddenly changed. He immediately turned around and saw that the cliff on the east side of the valley was collapsing in a cloud of smoke. Everyone fell into the same state of sluggishness. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 180. Romaine wasn't able to maintain such a quiet state all the time. She obediently knelt in front of Brando with her head lowered. If it weren't for the fact that she would steal glances at Brando's expression from time to time, she would have the demeanor of a noble's daughter. Of course, her face was covered in dirt, and her clothes were full of scratches. She was in such a sorry state. There was another noble's daughter who was in a similar state. Amandina was clutching her tattered shawl with one hand, her face covered in dust. She lowered her head and didn't say a word, looking a little nervous. Brando, The Roman saw that the young man's dark face seemed to have eased a little, and hurriedly opened her mouth to explain. But before she could finish her sentence, she was glared at by the young man. She could only sullenly lower her head again. She thought that the plan this time was perfect. If it weren't for the little hiccup at the end, she would have been able to help Brando a lot. Besides, even if there was a little hiccup at the end, didn't they still crush a few lizard men to death? Moreover, they also sealed off their escape route. She thought to herself that she must use less next time. But if Brando knew that this damned girl in front of him was still thinking about continuing this dangerous activity next time, he would probably have the mood to strangle her to death. He and Nalina went to the scene to investigate. Originally, Amandina's plan was indeed good, and according to the young lady's original calculations, when the cliff collapsed, it would have killed most of the lizard men who fled in that direction. Unfortunately, she obviously found the wrong partner. No, it shouldn't be said like that. Because Amandina's plan was originally only on paper. If it wasn't for the Roman who saw it, this idea would have been just a proposal until now. But unfortunately, there was no if in history. Just like how the word cautious did not exist in the young Roman's dictionary, she had always been a doer, and any of her plans were built on the basis of a matter of fact. Brando thought of this and couldn't help but look at Amandina. The noble's daughter seemed to have felt his gaze and couldn't help but shrink back. She whispered, "I'm sorry, my lord, it's all my fault. No, this has nothing to do with you." Brando shook his head. Indeed, if the Roman didn't arbitrarily change the amount of medicine that Amandina had said at the end, it wouldn't have caused such a mess. In the end, the lizard men didn't crush 2 lizard men to death, and instead almost buried them under the cliff. Fortunately, Amandina discovered this early, or else the consequences would have been unthinkable. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but to time to Amandina to time. This was what angered him the most. He didn't care how much Roman had helped him. As long as she didn't always put herself in danger, he would be thankful. But he couldn't help but sigh of a person. Of course, but there were times when she was so muddle-headed that it gave people a headache. For example, Brando rubbed his temples. "Have you always been making plans like this?" Brando suddenly asked. Amandina was taken aback. She thought he was going to punish her for her actions, but she didn't. His pampering of the Roman was obvious to everyone. She didn't dare to imagine what Brando would think of her if something happened to the merchant girl because of her. Although she had experienced the most difficult period, people were like this. It was easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. She felt that she could no longer adapt to the life of that time. Moreover, this young lord respected her and was willing to give her the same status and treatment as before. He was also willing to get along with her as an equal. Other than the hard work of trekking in the wilderness every day, she felt that there was nothing she could complain about. Moreover, even if it was hard work, it was only temporary. She still had many plans that had yet to be realized. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel ashamed. "I'm sorry, no." Brando glanced at the Roman to make sure that he wasn't seriously regretting his actions. "I'm talking about those plans." Amandina was stunned. For a moment, she didn't understand what Brando wanted to know. But in the end, she nodded her head. In fact, ever since Brando pulled her into the group, she had made a complete plan for every action of the youth. At first, she was indeed proud of her plans. But later on, it turned out that these plans were often immature. Especially when compared to Brando's prophetic decisions, they were more like the scribbles of a child. Amandina's desire to become Brendel's aide at the start was slowly disappearing from her mind, and she found it laughable. In the end, she did not give up on this habit of hers, but Brendel's. But compared to before, this was more like a self-examination. She made plans in advance, and then repeatedly tested her plans throughout the entire incident to see if she had matured enough and if she had given up on those unrealistic ideas. But she didn't think that she would be caught red-handed by the Roman, and he just happened to see her boldest idea. Thinking about it, she felt like Martha was playing a joke on her. "Why didn't you show it to me?" Brando asked. Brando was silent for a moment. He could roughly guess what this girl was thinking. He thought for a moment and said, "Miss Amandina, you are my aide, and this is what you recommended to me. Since that's the case, isn't it only right for you to give me your suggestion?" "I'm sorry. I know, but at that time, I didn't know that I was so childish. In the future, I will." Amandina replied in a small voice, her head almost touching her chest. Of course, Romaine wasn't so embarrassed. In fact, she even tried to interrupt. "Brando, this is my fault. Don't always find trouble with Amandina." Brando was not angered to death by her words. He thought that it was fortunate that he sent the Nightsong Tiger and Nalathar away, or else he wouldn't be able to maintain his dignity. He took a deep breath and was too lazy to pay attention to this girl. Instead, he continued, "Miss Amandina, everyone grows from being childish to mature. But the difference is that not everyone has a brain like yours. If you give up this opportunity because of your childishness, then you will be letting down Lady Martha's favor." After Brando finished speaking, he saw the noble girl looking at him with a puzzled expression. A person's perspective is always limited. Even though the Nightsong Tiger can help me solve many problems and is very experienced, there is one thing that he is far inferior to you, Miss Amandina. Brando pointed at his head. "That's why I hope that you will not put yourself out of this circle. I hope that you can help me. I believe that you can. So, are you willing to help me?" In fact, he wasn't just saying these words to comfort Amandina. He knew that he had the aura of a scammer, and it was a bit scary, especially for a girl like Amandina who was very competitive. It was a huge blow to her confidence. However, Brando knew that his foresight was only temporary. Even if he did not change the history of the world that much, his ability to foresee the future would only last for a few years. A few years later, the players began to participate in the history of this world. Compared to the previous game world, this was the biggest difference between this world and the previous one. Without the participation of players, the direction of the development of history would have some corresponding changes. At that time, his experience and some of the knowledge in the game would still be useful, but his ability to foresee the future would be greatly reduced. In fact, the whole process of this dungeon evolving to a perfect storyline was a wake-up call for him. Brando began to realize that he needed some help. In the previous game, he was never a top warrior, nor was he a top leader. Of course, the former could be made up for through experience, but the latter could only be made up for through another path. He had the future goddess of war, but that was not enough. Amandina's ability to discern the overall situation from small details was not something he could compare to. He looked at her and believed that she should have this ability as well. Perhaps there was a gap between her and a prophet, but it should be more than enough to be an aid. Amandina was stunned. Brando's words "I believe that you can," had deeply moved her. To a prideful person, there was nothing more precious than trust. Even though she still believed that Brando was comforting her, she took a light breath and nodded seriously. Her nod was not just an agreement, but a determination. She was willing to participate in his wishes. Brando did not expect his words to have such a great effect. He thought that at least he had dispelled her doubts. In his opinion, Amandina was a little too introverted. But he looked at the Roman and asked again, "Do you still have those exploding crystals?" "My lord, you know about them." Amandina was surprised again. "Ahem, something like that." Brando coughed. Could it be that this era doesn't have such things? Could it be that the exploding crystals were invented by this girl? How can there be such a coincidence? But he still said vaguely, "The Wizard Tower has something similar, so I just asked casually." "What a coincidence," Amandina whispered, "the name I gave it is also exploding crystals. In fact, I used the core of the mana conduction device to complete it, because the way it works is to use mana to break through the stable framework of the laws of the material world, causing the elements to quickly activate and create an explosion. That's why I gave it this name." "So you really invented it?" Brando could not help but look at the girl again. "This thing is not small." Even though it was gradually phased out in the later stages of the Second War of the Black Rose, it still caused a great impact in the early stages. At that time, the players all thought that this thing was an explosive in the world of magic. Unfortunately, the structure of this thing was too unstable, and it was not suitable for transportation and storage. Moreover, in the later stages of the war, the power of this thing became weaker. "Do you have more?" he asked. "There are still some," Amandina immediately replied. "If my lord needs them, I can make some overnight." "Overnight?" Brando was taken aback. "That's not right, right? Why would I need at least half a month to make this thing?" Seeing Amandina nodding, Brando almost thought that history had changed, and she had actually invented something else. Exploding crystals that only take a few hours to make. Isn't it a little too light to call it a cheat? But just as he was about to ask, he saw the Nightsong Tiger waving at him from the forest below with an anxious look on his face. Why is he here again? Aren't they cleaning up the battlefield with the red-handed girl? Brando was stunned for a moment, but when he saw that the Nightsong Tiger was about to run up to him, he immediately said to Amandina, "If it's possible, I hope that everyone can have 1 or 2 pieces. By the way, this thing is very unstable, right?" Amandina looked at him in surprise, then nodded. She felt that she was a little numb to her lord's foresight. As expected. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. "History hasn't changed yet," he said. "I'll teach you a method later. It can temporarily stabilize it, but the effect is limited. You can research the rest on your own." "Aw." Amandina couldn't help but cry out in surprise. "He knows about this too." Amandina thought that she had at least become a little more resilient, but she couldn't help but feel another blow. She originally thought that she had some advantages in the field of magic, but she didn't expect Brando to know more about it than her. But this noble girl from the Braggs probably didn't know that she had wronged Brando this time. This was because Brando didn't know anything about magic. In the game, it was a skill that only pure secondary class players could choose. A combat class player like him was destined to have no chance. But even if he didn't understand it, it didn't stop Brando from knowing some materials and recipes, right? While Amandina was still in shock, the Roman finally noticed that the only person who could control her had left. Amandina let out a long sigh, then said gratefully to Amandina, "Thank you, Amandina." Amandina looked at her and quickly shook her head. "As long as you don't cause trouble for me, I'll thank the heavens." To be honest, she was now afraid of this young lady. But the Roman didn't seem to want to let go of the only person who could talk to her. She thought for a moment and asked, "Right, Amandina, did you see that?" "That? That's right. When we were being buried, we were still alive. It looks like there are some fireflies flying towards us from the bottom of the hill. Did you notice that?" "This, was it?" "It seems like it." When Brando saw the Night Song Tiger, he saw the veteran mercenary captain holding a thick book with a black cover. He was slightly surprised. This book was undoubtedly the Dark Bishop's relic. At least, the 3 lightning-like scratches on the book had already deeply betrayed it. But Brando was a little surprised. The red-handed girl was indeed a red-handed girl. She was actually able to get an item from the Dark Bishop, who was publicly known as a pauper. If this was in the past, he would be able to brag about it on the forums. Unfortunately, there were no forums here, and this made Brando feel a little awkward. Moreover, he wasn't the one who opened this book. "What is this?" he asked. The Night Song Tiger looked at him mysteriously and didn't say a word. He just gently opened the book in front of him. Brando only took a glance, and then he was petrified. P.S. Perfectly defeated the prophetic emperor. All of you will be sent to the 8th floor. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 181. What is this? Brando was stunned. "As you can see, my lord," the Night Song Tiger pursed his lips into a straight line and pretended to be calm and mysterious, but his light brown eyes were shining with excitement. "These are the cards of fate." He opened the book, separated his thumb from his forefinger, and pointed at the 6 cards stuck on the page. "I know," Brando asked without blinking, "but why are there so many?" He looked at the booklet. If there were 6 cards per page, there would be at least 40 or 50 cards. The Night Song Tiger raised his eyebrows. "I think it's better for Mr. Shire to answer this question." "The Shire? You know him?" The young man turned around and looked at the Night Song Tiger in confusion. "Of course, creatures from the cards are connected to each other. In a sense, we exist in the same subspace created by you, Sir Planeswalker." The mercenary captain held the book in one hand and said naturally, "When we are not summoned, we live in the territory built by the land cards. In another sense, the elemental wealth and wealth that my lord pays are the supplies that maintain our movement in the material world. The higher the level of the unit, the higher the cost of maintaining it." Brando noted down the term subspace. When the Night Song Tiger mentioned supplies, he subconsciously looked at his remaining resources: 6 nature, 6 water, 67 wealth, 17 reputation. Of course, there were still some elemental crystals left in his bag, and half of them were fire elemental crystals. He then looked at the Night Song Tiger with suspicion. "That doesn't sound like something you would say." The Night Song Tiger laughed. "Haha, my lord is wise. These are Mr. Charles's original words. I'm just a mouthpiece. You can contact him." Brendel suddenly felt that he had asked a stupid question, because he saw the mercenary leader nodding his head. "Very well," he said, "if that's the case, can you tell me what's going on? I remember Tumen telling me that no one can see the cards of fate unless the Planeswalker himself or agrees to it. But why does this guy have so many of them? Is he actually a Planeswalker or has some kind of potential? Or are these things not found on the Dark Bishop?" No, of course I got it from the Dark Bishop's corpse. But unlike the usual cards of fate, this is a card collection. What's different about the card set? Brando interrupted him. The Nightsong Tiger paused for a moment as if he was waiting for an answer. Then he looked up and said, Mr. Shire said that the lifespan of a planeswalker is not infinite. When the current generation of planeswalkers reaches the end of their lives, the cards they have collected will be sealed together. In this state, the cards were materialized. Even ordinary people could see and even touch them. But to them, these things were no different from the ordinary cards used by diviners. But for another planeswalker, this was a valuable inheritance. Of course, there are other situations where the cards would be left behind, but most of them are the former. You're saying that the Dark Bishop got this card collection by chance, but he didn't know what it was used for. The possibility is high, but Mr. Shire doesn't rule out your speculation. Brando shook his head. If the Dark Bishop was really a planeswalker, why didn't he use the cards to deal with him? The Nightsong Tiger knew that what the Nightsong Tiger said was probably the truth. He knew that the young man was just flattering him subconsciously. But he thought for a moment and immediately asked, if that's the case, isn't there a possibility of planeswalkers stealing cards from each other? There is indeed such a possibility. The Nightsong Tiger seriously played the role of a messenger, but most planeswalkers don't fight to the death because most of the cards are not unique. Unless it's a real lunatic, very few people would kill for the sake of the cards of fate. What do you mean by not unique? Yes, most of the cards are not unique. At the same time, at different places, there may be multiple copies of the same card. Even if it's a new card deck, it's the same. But every card is unique to the planeswalker. My lord, you can summon the Highland Squire, and I will serve you. Other planeswalkers may also have the Highland Squire card, but they may not be able to summon the Shire. It could be Mordenkainen, or it could be Ivar. In short, the rules are based on the summoner's subconscious, but once it's established, it can't be changed. The mercenary captain spread out his hands and explained, so, next time, even if you want to summon a beautiful blonde mercenary captain, Nightingale, to serve you, it's impossible. The first half of the sentence is Mr. the Shire's original words, and the second half is my addition. Are you mocking me for being an uncle fetish? Brendel's eyes twitched, and he said in a low voice, that's unnecessary. Also, you mentioned the seal before, which means I can't use the cards directly. The Nightsong Tiger nodded. Then, the Nightsong Tiger handed over the black cards. Take a look and you'll know. Brando took the cards with a dubious look. Just as his finger touched the first card, strange words appeared in front of his eyes, 1400 reputation. He was slightly surprised, but when he focused his attention, the words immediately became rich, Platinum Angel, Immortal Alliance 19, NE 40, Mana 50, Divine Artifact, Angel, Level 60 Elite. When the Platinum Angel is on the battlefield, the summoner will not die from damage. Maintenance cost: when the Platinum Angel is on the battlefield, pay 10 NE, 10 gems per day. The secret of immortality is buried in the heart. Hint: unsealing this card requires at least 1400 reputation. 1400 reputation. Brando almost threw the card out. When the Shire was still around, he could earn 1 reputation per day from this card, but from the start to the end, he only had 17 reputation. Later on, when this card entered the graveyard, its source was cut off, 1,400 reputation points. Oh Marcia, even if he went to rob others, he wouldn't be able to get that much. This card set wasn't meant to be played with, right? He looked at the faceless Platinum Angel on the card and was speechless for a moment, but his eyes subconsciously drifted to the next card, Eternal Nectar, Immortal Alliance X, NE 10, Mana 50, Divine Artifact, tap and pay 5 light. You recover half of your HP, shuffle the Eternal Nectar and your graveyard into your deck. Bottled Life. The taste is not to my liking, and it's not fresh, but at least the effect is the same. Baron Singh hint, unsealing this card requires 2,000 wealth. Brando resisted the urge to vomit blood. He did have a little more wealth, but compared to 2,000 wealth, it was like a drop in the ocean. The Nightsong Tiger didn't purposely use this card to hurt him, right? These cards were powerful, but the price to pay was astronomical. But after thinking about it, he didn't seem to have offended the Nightsong Tiger recently, so he didn't have the motive to do this. But what was the meaning of this? He couldn't help but look at the cards suspiciously, but he found that the quality of the cards decreased as he went on, but the cost was also gradually becoming more bearable. Sacred Flame Lord, Time Reversal, Iana's Judgment, Lion of Nia. Based on a rough estimate, there were at least 40 cards in the entire set. Half of them were light and dark cards, and there were also a few red cards. There were also land cards, but the payment method was different. Some required reputation, some required wealth, and some required the level of a planeswalker. Brando turned a blind eye to these. He was still a level 1 planeswalker, and he found that this thing was not related to the experience system. For the time being, he didn't know how to increase the level of this profession. And these were the more common ones. There were also some that Brando had never heard of. For example, some required certain resources, some kind of land card, some kind of enchantment, and even other professions. For example, the Time Reversal scroll stated that the owner had to be at least a rank 20 wizard in order to unlock it. In short, there were all kinds of strange things. But Brando looked at most of them, and he was unable to satisfy them for the time being. He flipped the pages forward, and finally, his eyes gradually lit up. Because soon, he found that there were at least 2 pages of 10 cards that he could afford. They were Scarlet Vanguard, Black Earth Lion, Hymn of Light, The Shire's Bazaar, Rogan's Swamp, Eternal Land, Voice of the Lower Realm, Master Kazando, Halar Guard, and Pristine Archangel. But even for these 10 cards, after deducting the price, with his current strength, he could only draw 3 of them. So he had to make a choice. Brando's first need was, of course, the Dark Element land card. He chose Rogan's Swamp without hesitation. But when he paid 10 wealth in exchange for this card, he found that this land card was obviously not as mature as the Elven Secret Land. In fact, in addition to providing 1 free dark element every week, tapping Rogan's Swamp would only give him 1 dark element. Compared to the latter, which could provide 2 natural element and 1 water element when tapped, the difference was huge. But at least it solved half of the problem of the maintenance cost of the Unicorn Knight card. The remaining problem was the problem of wealth. So the second card he chose was the Bazaar of the Shire's Bazaar. This was a special land card that could provide 2 wealth and 1 earth element every day. When tapped, he could get 6 wealth. The cost of unsealing this special land card was double that of the basic land card, which required 20 wealth. After paying for the card, he was left with a little more than 10 wealth. In fact, he could have bought another basic land card, but considering the cost of maintaining Medusa's presence in the arena, he could only give up on that idea. As for the third card, it was without a doubt the one he needed the most, Pristine Archangel. Pristine Archangel, Immortal Alliance 3, Light 5, Creature, Angel Knight, Level 20 Elite. When Pristine Archangel enters the game, choose a non-black card from your graveyard and shuffle it into your deck. Maintenance cost: when Pristine Archangel is in the game, pay 1 light per day. The light of mercy descends from the heavens, and God's emissary goes forth from the light. This card required 10 reputation points to unseal, so there was no need to pay anything from Brando's already pitiful treasury. But what made Brando a little awkward was that he did not have any light elemental land cards or light elemental crystals. Therefore, it was impossible for him to get the Shire or the Wind Spirit Spiders out of the graveyard. He could only pat the Nightsong Tiger's shoulder and ask him to tell the Shire to stay in the graveyard for a while. But then he thought of another question. When he asked the Nightsong Tiger how to unseal the graveyard, didn't he confidently say that only dark elemental cards had such a method? He could not help but look at the Nightsong Tiger suspiciously. He did not expect the experienced mercenary leader to hesitate for a long time before replying. Actually, at that time, the Nightsong Tiger was just making a wild guess. Brando's face was filled with tears. P.S. It has been a long time since I last saw Amber in the recommendation spot. My collection has not increased in a long time. Students, please click on the recommendation button so that this book can appear on the front page or something. Speaking of which, these few chapters involved a large number of card settings. My head is about to explode from all the writing. For the sake of my hard work, everyone, please subscribe and recommend me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support legal reading. Chapter 182. Closing the card collection, Brando let out a long sigh. Although it was not perfect, at least it was an unexpected gain, and a very big one at that. Originally, he only hoped that he could use the dark elemental crystal to summon the silver elf girl Metasha for a short period of time to help him solve this battle before sending her back. To be honest, this was not a cost-effective action. After all, displaying the unicorn card once required 15 dark elemental points, and the maintenance fee was much cheaper. And the key problem was that his elemental pool was pitifully small. Once the dark elemental crystal was used up, he estimated that he would not be able to see this powerful female knight for a second time in a short period of time. But with the Rogan Swamp and the market in the Shire of Roe, he could barely maintain Metasha on the field permanently. With the help of a gold tier, it could be said that the adventure in the Southern Territory and the exploration of the territory, which originally seemed risky, did not seem so dangerous now. Moreover, he had also obtained the grave digging card, although there was no way to use it for the time being. But Brando thought to himself, as long as he had the heart, a planeswalker would not be afraid of not being able to find a land card. The Nightsong Tiger had also said that compared to land cards, grave digging cards were much rarer. Of course, the premise was that this guy did not open his mouth and ask for it. Regarding this point, Brando still kept an eye on it and planned to find time to find out from the Nightsong Tiger about the situation in the Shire. After all, compared to this unreliable middle-aged mercenary captain, the young squire was much more adorable. But the real benefit that this card collection brought to Brando was the long term. In fact, when he flipped through this card collection, he already had a rough plan in his mind. The other cards that seemed to be easily obtainable, such as the Scarlet Vanguard, Black Earth Lion, Master Kazando, and Haler Guard, as level 20 to level 30 elite and non-elite level summon creatures, seemed to be really coveted. But for Brando, his short-term goal was not so. On the contrary, he intended to accumulate enough wealth points to get the remaining 2 fire elemental land cards and 1 wind elemental land card in this card collection. Without basic land and magic power, no matter how strong the summoned creatures were, they would not be able to maintain it. On the other hand, before the troops and horses were mobilized, the provisions had to be mobilized first. This was a basic principle that everyone understood. His midterm goal was the Ocean Wave gem that was worth 60 wealth points and the Silver Swallowtail flag that was worth 100 wealth points. One of these 2 treasure cards provided wealth points while the other provided reputation points. It was just enough to lay the foundation for further strengthening his strength. Once he had enough wealth and reputation points, he could consider the higher level cards in the future. For example, the Platinum Angel was a level 60 elite divine artifact creature with a heaven-defying ability. Once summoned, he would be able to do whatever he wanted in the south of Ranner. If not the whole of Aween, he would be able to do whatever he wanted in Aween. However, a beautiful future was still a future, and Brando knew that it was not the time to daydream. On the contrary, it was a race against time. Even though the Dark Bishop was beheaded, Conrad and Hugel should be alerted. According to the information he obtained from the captives, Medicia's necklace should be with that damned lizard. However, the rest of the battle would be the real battle. He kept the card collection and looked at the Nightsong Tiger. What about the other items? What other items? The Nightsong Tiger was taken aback. The crystals of darkness. Oh, the Nightsong Tiger was enlightened. The Dark Bishop left behind a pile of them after he self-destructed, but they have all solidified and cooled. I'm getting my men to knock them down. Brando knew that he did not need to worry about the number of crystals of darkness in the short term. He thought about it and realized that the Nightsong Tiger was right. The Dark Bishop dropped at least 40 to 50 crystals of darkness. The cheapest elemental crystal on the auction site was the crystals of darkness. Of course, there were also fire elemental crystals that were as plentiful as the hairs on a cow. Is there anything else? He asked again. Right, there's also this. The Nightsong Tiger nodded and took out a black, shuttle-shaped stone from his bosom. This was also found by Falerne. Brando was not surprised when he saw the blood-stained stone. He recognized that the stone in the Nightsong Tiger's hand was the vessel for the blood of God. When the blood of God was injected into a target, the tree herders could use this vessel to control the divine envoy. However, Brando did not intend to do so because once a living being completely transformed into a divine envoy, she would no longer be a monster and would lose her original humanity. Brendel could indeed use it to control the monster, but to watch the girl slowly lose her sense of self and turn into a completely different creature, he did not think that he could be so indifferent to her. He took the stone shuttle, and with a light push, he broke it into 2 pieces with a cracked sound. My lord. The Nightsong Tiger was stunned. Brando shook his head and signaled him not to ask too much. He only replied, after losing the scabbard, the blood of God will enter a state of hibernation for a short period of time. Go and tell the Grey Wolves mercenaries that if Scarlet wakes up, tell her to come to me alone and talk to me. The Nightsong Tiger nodded and was about to leave when Brando stopped him. Wait. What? The Shire said that you live in a territory built by land cards. The Nightsong Tiger nodded. Brando looked at his own land card. At the edge of the forest formed by the sacred tree's secret grounds, there was a dark swamp, and in the transition zone between the swamp and the forest was a small town. Brando looked down from the sky like a giant and guessed that the small town was probably the market of the Shire of Rhodes. Then, he came back to his senses from the spiritual world and asked, "Can you build anything there?" Of course, the Nightsong Tiger replied, but the core of the land card is still the land card. All the resource cards are attached to the land card to exploit the wealth and resources stored in the land card. Summons can also be used to exploit the resources on the land card, but not now. Overall, my lord, as a planeswalker, your control over your power is still too unfamiliar. The Nightsong Tiger chose a more subtle way to point out Brando's shortcomings. Of course, it is also because my lord's deck of cards is not mature enough. In fact, the subspace of a planeswalker is a world of its own. The Shire told me to tell my lord this. That is why planeswalkers are so passionate about collecting cards. A mature card will accelerate the formation of a world, and a mature world will allow a planeswalker to gain more power. This is the foundation, and they complement each other. I see. Brando muttered. Is there anything else, my lord? The Nightsong Tiger looked at him and asked. Of course, Brando nodded. Tell the others to get ready. This is only a victory, and our battle is far from over. As you wish. It was already noon on the second day when Conrad met with Hugel. Even though the leader of the paper cards mercenaries had already sensed that something was amiss, Hugel was not as vigilant as he was. He had ventured too far into the forest, and it was only in the morning that Conrad's dragoons managed to catch up to him. On the other hand, the dragoons that he had sent to the Blackfire sect were still nowhere to be seen. Conrad knew that the situation had taken a turn for the worse, and he continued to send dragoons in the direction of Hugel to maintain contact while he rushed back as fast as he could. He was afraid that Brando and his men would take advantage of the time when the Dark Bishop was defeated to break through the defense line of the lizard men in the Balagon ruins and escape from their territory. If that happened, it could be said that their operation would be in vain, and they would suffer heavy losses. But he would never have imagined that Brando's plan was to take over the tree herders. That was why he and Hugel, the leader of the lizard men, could not help but heave a sigh of relief when they saw the Silver Elves' ruins. They saw that there were still many lizard men patrolling the ruins, which meant that they were a step too late. The flames of war had not reached here yet. Or rather, it was fortunate that they reacted in time. Conrad, this is your plan. The lizardman bandit leader heaved a sigh of relief and turned around. His long and narrow face seemed to be magnified in front of the mercenary leader in an instant. The lizard man stared at him coldly with his emerald green eyes. Many of my men have been lost. Once this is over, I will double the compensation. Conrad snorted coldly. He could not be bothered with the lizard man. Hugel, who was known for its cold-bloodedness, would never care about how many men it had lost. It was just using this opportunity to blackmail him. But Conrad was not in the mood to argue with it. He faintly felt that something was wrong. The Dark Bishop seemed to have met with disaster, but according to the information he received, none of the three of them should have met with any problems. Unless that white-haired bastard dared to lie to him. But that was impossible. He believed in his methods. That young man definitely did not lie. Moreover, the results of the lizardman's investigation also proved this point. Conrad shook his head, as if he wanted to get rid of the uncertainty in his heart. But what he did not know was that in the ruins not far away, there were also people who were watching them. In the ruins of the majestic Silver Elves buildings, the mercenaries of Lopez, the Grey Wolves mercenaries, and the Silver Elves heavy infantry were quietly hiding in the shadows. They were waiting for an opportunity. Or rather, an order. Everyone looked behind them. There, Brando was explaining his final plan to his subordinates. His goal was simple, to take the initiative and kill with one blow. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 183. Scarlet, Nalathar, the Nightsong Tiger, and Samford all stood quietly behind him. Brando was holding a rough stone slab in his hand, his gaze piercing through the broken walls of the elven ruins towards the direction of the valley. The lizard men were appearing one after another in that direction, their short figures flashing through the gaps between the trees. The unevolved reptiles would occasionally appear and disappear. Brando glanced at them and roughly estimated that there were at least 2 large groups of them, no less than 300 of them, and there might be even more behind them. It seems that Hugel and Conrad have joined forces. They're very vigilant, the young man confirmed. He looked up and saw that it was a sunny day, but the sky was so blue that it seemed a little purple. Sunlight flowed through the forest in the afternoon, and the trees near and far were covered in a dazzling shade of green. He squinted his eyes. The air was filled with a faint smell of blood. Even though the battlefield had been cleaned up, it was inevitable that the smell of slaughter from before would still remain. The stone slab in the young man's hand was the sage slate. It was about the size of a fist, and there was a rune engraved on it. The rune was the sound of Deem, and it represented the word earth in the ancient runes. The earth is home to life and wisdom. Now that he had the sage slate, he had at least achieved half of his original goal. The only thing left was to get Metish's necklace from the lizard men. But just as he was thinking about this, he suddenly heard a rustling sound behind him. Brando turned around and saw the fairy princess, who had tied up her long silver hair and was wearing a holy white armor. She was leading her unicorn towards him. The armor of the silver elves was so gorgeous that Brando almost thought that the princess knight was wearing a princess's dress with silver leaves. "Thank you, my lord." Medusa looked at Brendel with her glassy eyes and smiled. "Thank you, my lord," she said in his mind. "It's a promise." Brendel finally managed to shift his gaze away from her and answered. Medusa blushed. Brando's words reminded her of what had happened that day. She had never been so scared before, to the point where she cried in front of so many people. She had completely thrown away the etiquette of royalty. She couldn't help but look to the other side and saw the red-haired girl named Scarlet standing alone in the shadows of the canopy. Her eyes shone like amber in a flame. She leaned on her slender lightning spear and looked outside. She seemed to be a little quiet. Brando had already told her everything that had happened, including the blood of God and the disbandment of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She had been like this ever since she heard about it. He was neither sad nor angry. "What will happen to that big sister?" Medusa turned around and asked softly. "The blood of God has taken root in her body, and the contamination cannot be removed. He could only rely on his willpower to suppress it. Once he lost control, he would eventually become an oracle. But calling her an oracle is just a beautiful title. It would be better to call her a monster." Brando replied. But he had another idea. That was to obtain Scarlet's consent and seal her as a card. Because the connection of the laws had already been established, all that was left was a contract. But to seal a living being into a card, that's a little too harsh for a free person. That's why I won't reveal this method until the very last moment. The silver elf girl couldn't help but frown at his words. But the innate silence of this race made her not say anything. Brando didn't say anything either. His gaze stopped at the mercenaries not far away. These mercenaries were hiding in the ruins of the masterpieces of the silver elf architects from thousands of years ago. Their crossbows were pointed at the lizard men in front of them, so that they wouldn't immediately abandon their weapons and run away. In fact, Brando had already attacked and razed the base of the lizard men bandits to the ground a few hours ago. With the help of Scarlet and Medusa, 2 gold rankers, and 20 silver elf guards who were still in the middle of the silver elves, the 200 lizard men that stayed behind to guard the base were nothing more than experience points for Brando. As for the remaining ones, they were now in front of Brando as a distraction. Brando. Hearing this familiar voice with a little bit of pride, Brando didn't need to turn around to know who was calling him. So he didn't even bother to turn around, and directly stretched his hand over his shoulder and asked, "So fast?" The Roman walked over with Amandina. She calmly placed 3 thumb-sized translucent gray crystals on his palm and replied, "Of course, Lord Roman is very efficient. These are for you, Brando. Everyone and the elves have distributed them according to your orders. You can say that all the preparations are done, and we're just waiting for your orders." "It's a pity that the materials are all used up," Amandina forced a smile even though her face was tired, "otherwise, we could make more. I've already used all the materials we used before on them. The sample of the mana conduction device was also removed according to your orders, and the ores inside are also included." Brando nodded and carefully inserted the crystals into his belt. He then took the sword from the Nightsong tiger and pointed outside. "The enemy is very vigilant, we can't fool them for long. Once we're close enough, I'll attract their attention. Medusa and Scarlet, come with me. Our goal is to tie down Conrad and the Earth Angel. As for the other small fries, leave them to Nalathar and his men." The elven commander looked at them and nodded. "Don't just nod, Commander," Brando did not intend to let him go, "don't forget your promise." Nalathar smiled, "I'll wait and see." Medusa looked at the two of them and couldn't help but smile. "Scarlet, do you have any questions?" Brando asked again. I understand. The red-haired girl nodded and replied. Nightsong Tiger, your mission is to follow behind the elven allies and protect them, Brendel added in his mind. Make sure to protect the Grey Wolves mercenaries. They can't revive like you. Brendel turned to Sanford after seeing the Nightsong Tiger nod. You too, make sure to protect yourselves. Only by surviving can you enjoy victory. Of course, my lord. Brendel nodded respectfully. Brando looked at the people around him and relaxed. Other than Nalathar, the people here were almost all of his subordinates. Of course, Redo's side might have some power, but the Grey Wolves mercenaries were different from these people. In fact, he understood that in the eyes of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Redo's status and prestige was higher than his. However, the people in front of him were all people he knew very well. There was no need to mention the Nightsong Tiger and Medisha. Amandina and the Grey Wolves mercenaries had no one to rely on other than him, so they naturally wouldn't have any other thoughts. Of course, it wasn't that he didn't trust Redo, but time would reveal a person's heart. Brando wouldn't easily reveal his secrets. He had seen too many betrayals in his life. There were plenty of people who would stab you in the back even in the game, let alone in real life. After assigning everyone their tasks, he turned back to observe the lizardmen's movements in the forest. Conrad and Hugel did not seem to have discovered the abnormality, but he did not expect to be able to hide it from them for long. One round of attacks was enough. The closest lizard men were already 2 miles away, and shadows began to appear in the forest. The lizard men did not make the dragon hunters split up the vanguard like they did in the wild. This was great news for Brendel. Their opponents were lax, and the first strike would be more effective. 700 meters. Brando read this number from the distance device. The large number of lizardmen warriors seemed to cause the entire valley to rustle as they passed through the forest. It was as if water was flowing through the forest, or as if countless ants were running on the ground. In fact, Brando could already see the mercenaries on his side at the front lines putting their hands on their belts. They were holding the disintegration crystal that Amandina gave them. Although it wasn't big, its explosive energy was around 15 ounces, and its damage was comparable to the magic arrow of a low-ranked iron-ranked elementalist. 500 meters. A large number of lizardmen figures appeared in the forest. Brando, Nalathar, Medisha, and Scarlet could clearly see the expressions on the lizardmen's faces. These lizardmen who had been running for the whole night were tired, and they probably didn't realize that they would be ambushed at their doorstep. The red-haired girl squatted down and pulled a blade of grass from the ground and bit it in her mouth. Then she frowned and looked for a familiar figure in the forest, Conrad. She gripped the lightning spear tightly. The lizardmen continued to move forward. In fact, they had already noticed that the ruins were unusually quiet. It was just a kind of inertia that drove the army forward. But soon, Brando saw more than 10 lizardmen passing through the crowd. Wherever they passed, the lizardmen would stop moving. We've been discovered. Brando immediately realized. He was a little annoyed that Conrad and Hugel didn't appear at all. Their alertness was beyond his expectations. But he couldn't care less. He raised his arm. The ruby ring on his index finger pointed in the direction of the forest. Then, a red light flashed, as if the light of the sun had dimmed for a moment. A huge fireball rose from the forest, accompanied by countless leaves flying into the air. Then, everyone heard a loud bang. The heat wave swept across the forest like a shock wave, blowing the hair of the mercenaries, the elves, and Brando. The hot wind blew. Brendel learned from the data on his retina that he had killed at least 20 lizard men. This was an unexpected gain, and it showed that the enemy's formation was very tight. But this was only a signal to attack. Immediately, the mercenaries threw the disintegration crystals in their hands at the area the fireball was aiming at. 300 meters was not far for those who had the strength of iron. The thumb-sized crystals sparkled brightly as they drew an arc in the air, and then fell into the forest like it was raining. There was a moment of silence. But that was just the calm before the storm. A white light flashed, and then a second, and then a third, one after another, flashes of white light appeared in the forest. Then, there was a continuous explosion. The sound waves seemed to have lifted a layer of the ground. Almost everyone felt the ground tremble for at least a minute. Those who squinted their eyes because of the loud explosion found that the landscape of the forest in front of them had changed forever. The explosion had created a vacuum in the middle of the forest. The tall trees were uprooted or tilted. But what was more tragic were the lizard men who were covered in the explosion. There were at least a squadron of more than 100 lizard men there. But now, they were mutilated corpses. Blood mixed with the soil, soaked in blood, and red organs hung on the branches. It was a scene that reminded people of hell. Even Brando could not help but retch. But he suppressed the nausea and began to recalculate the difference between the enemy and himself. In fact, Hugel had brought the most lizard men with him yesterday. There were at least 400 of them. Brando suspected that if it was not for the need to search, the arrogant lizard men would not have given any of their men to Conrad and the Dark Bishop. Since they had the disciples of the Black Flames and the Dark Mercenaries, they were more than enough to protect themselves. Of course, that was if the lizard men thought that he only had a dozen Silver-Tier guards with him. In addition to Conrad's group and the Dark Mercenaries, the total number of enemies they had to face was at least 700. This wasn't a small number. Even if they managed to kill more than 10% of the enemies, the rest would not be easy to deal with. They had to do it again. He knew that it was time for him to make his move. He immediately gestured to Metisha and Scarlet to get ready to fight with him. Roggen Swamp, White Bones 4, Basic Ground, Swamp, generate 1 dark EP into the mana pool every week. Tap, construct a swamp, generate 1 dark EP into the mana pool. Rot, this is a barren land, the Shire of Rose Market, Alliance of the City XX, Special Ground, City, generate 2 wealth per day. Generate 1 earth EP into the mana pool every week. Tap, pay 2 reputation, receive 6 wealth. From trade, fame, wealth, and power, the Rochelers got everything they wanted. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 184. Metisha. Brando gestured to the silver elf girl beside him. The princess of the Hyalan Empire lifted the winged silver helmet with both hands, and after firmly putting it on, she mounted her horse. With one hand, she lowered the face guard that was covering the upper half of her face, and replied in a clear and melodious voice, "Here." Her snow-white chainmail gloves made caw-caw noises as she gripped her silver spear tightly, the tip of the spear pointed towards the sky. Half of her face was exposed under the mask, and her lips were pursed tightly. The girl's aura became solemn in an instant. The unicorn stomped its feet. It was also fully armored. The silver chainmail of the elves was intricate, but it had incredible defense against slashing and piercing. On the outside was a snow-white battle robe with the national emblem of the Elven Empire, the lily flower. Metisha was the same. She wore a snow-white robe, and her silver armor shone with a dazzling radiance. It made people think that she was the holy white knight of the legends who had walked down from a scroll. Her transformation from fantasy to reality was complete in front of everyone. "Let's go." The girl nodded, and the unicorn sped up as she sat on it. One person and one horse trotted around the broken wall and appeared on a wide road. This road was used by the Silver Elves to complete their rituals in the past. It was used by the elven priests to bring along the sacred relics of the elven goddess Shay. Hundreds of years passed by in a flash. Although the grass had covered the white marble used to pave the road in the past, and history seemed to have settled silently in the ruins where no sound could be made and no words could be used to describe what had happened in the past, the young female knight swept across the road as if the elven cavalrymen were passing through the road again, conveying the will of the goddess with a solemn and low voice. Silver elves. Conrad, who was far behind the lizard men, squinted his eyes. He turned around and grabbed Hugel by the collar and roared, "You bastard, what did you do? Those are the Silver Elves. The Heron Empire's Silver Elves. Why did you provoke them?" Hugel was also shocked. He had been eyeing the Silver Elf King's tomb for several years now. At first, he had been very careful, afraid that the legendary Silver Elves who dared to sing hymns and charge at the Dark Army's army of hundreds of thousands would one day attack him. But as the days passed, nothing happened. The hidden Silver Elves seemed to have kept their promise and no longer appeared on the continent. In fact, the Lizardman leader even suspected that this proud race had gone extinct for some unknown reason. That so-called escape was probably nothing more than a lie. But just as it was about to relax, its courage grew, and it was getting closer and closer to the graveyard of the Elven Kings. The Silver Elves finally appeared again. Although Hugel's eyesight was not as good as the gold-ranked Conrad's, his white helmet and silver armor, as well as that artistic battle skirt and armor, were as beautiful as a work of art. In the whole of Wonde, other than the Silver Elves, there was no other warrior as flamboyant as him. Hugel sucked in a breath of cold air, and then Conrad grabbed him by the collar and shouted, "Conrad, young man, look over there." Conrad turned around. When he turned around, he saw Brando and Scarlet appear on his left and right. They separated behind the Elven Knight, and it was as if a silver flame and a red flame had bloomed. After the two flames separated, they paused for a moment and shot into the battlefield in the blink of an eye. Their speed was so fast that it was almost impossible to catch them. When Conrad locked onto them again, a silver longsword and a crimson spear had already cut off two lizardmen's heads. Damn it! Conrad threw Hugel aside. His eyes were sharp, and he could see that Metisha and Scarlet were stronger than him. Although the young man was only a silver rank 1, he was not someone to be trifled with. Although he did not know where these strong enemies came from, he recognized the red-haired girl with the ponytail. He had killed Scarlet that night, and although the Dark Bishop had used the blood of gods to save her, shouldn't she have become an oracle? But at this moment, Conrad exhaled and calmed down instead. At the very least, he was certain that the divine priest of the Black Fire sect, who was incapable of accomplishing anything, was most likely dead. Only uncertain things were worth being afraid of. "Leave it to me. You better take back your nest before I solve the problem." He looked at Hugel coldly, and then took off a pair of black steel gloves and put them on. The leader of the Lizardmen bandits did not dare to respond. He knew that Conrad was on the verge of exploding with anger. If he was not careful, he might really lose his life. Usually, he dared to go against Conrad, but at this time, he did not want to get into trouble. But when he saw that Conrad was about to leave, he stammered, Silver Elf. Deal with it yourself." Conrad snorted without turning back. If the Silver Elves were really the brainless lizards' doing, he did not want to get involved. Although the Tree Herders were a large organization, they were not afraid of the Silver Elf Empire, Heron. Furthermore, the Silver Elf Empire was a race that had been hidden for a long time. But they were still the holy warriors of the legends, and no one would want to get into trouble with them. This stupid lizard was just a fellow that could be abandoned at any time. In fact, compared to Hugel's troubles, he was more worried about how to explain the sacrifice of the Dark Bishop. Compared to these brainless reptiles, the disciples of the Black Flames had a much higher status among the tree shepherds. Although their leader, the goo insect overlord Myad, was only one of the 12 patriarchs, he was also one of the 4 patriarchs. He could cover up the deaths of the disciples of the Black Flames. After all, the operation this time was not small, and the mission even involved one of the Grand Dukes of the kingdom. But the loss of a low-ranked dark priest was something that had never happened in the organization for at least 10 years. Conrad had a headache when he thought about it. He raised his head, and his cold gaze locked onto Brando, Medisha, and Scarlet. In his opinion, the only thing he could do now was to find Duke Lone's heir and take it one step at a time. Chase these lizard men away from the central battlefield. Brando shouted to Scarlet as he cut down a lizard man warrior in front of him with his sword. The red-haired girl nodded. She swung her fiery red ponytail, turned around, and swung her halberd backward. An arc-shaped bolt of lightning shot out with a sizzling sound. The lizard men immediately retreated, and those who retreated a little slower were burnt to a crisp before exploding into ashes. "Well done," the young man praised without hesitation. Even though the lizard men were only around level 20, there were still a lot of them. Including Nalathar, there were only 21 silver-ranked elven guards, and 17 iron-ranked mercenaries. But there were 500 to 600 lizard men here, and that was not including Conrad's mercenaries. If they all swarmed up, the consequences would be unimaginable. Thus, he had to think of a way to reduce the lizardmen's attack area, infinitely reduce the enemy's advantage in numbers, and increase his own personal strength. The method was simple. He, Medisha, and Scarlet were to firmly guard the center of the battlefield. But he did not expect that before he could even explain his thoughts, the red-haired girl seemed to understand his intentions as if she was telepathically connected to him. This kind of tactical insight did not seem like something that could be cultivated by a mercenary group. But his praise made Scarlet look at him in confusion. "Why are you praising me?" the red-haired girl asked. "Are you trying to please me?" "Phew. You did well. Do you need any other reason?" Brando grabbed a lizardman's spear and cut it down with a backhand slash. Then he took a deep breath and replied, "Up to you." Scarlet looked at him and then turned back. She used to fight for the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She had no family, and everyone in the group was her family. She wanted to protect her family, but now that her family was gone, all that was left was hatred. She always liked to do more than talk, and was a girl of few words. She only knew that she should do what she did. She was praised as if nothing had happened. Because everyone's eyes were on Eek, whether it was the leader or the others. Even she was the same. But Brando's thoughts were different from hers. He did not like to think about things that were too complicated. He only knew that Scarlet was now a gold-ranked fighter, and the Grey Wolves mercenaries no longer existed. Since there was an opportunity to take advantage of, he would be a fool not to take advantage of it and pull her into his camp. He had his own bottom line when it came to certain things, but he was not a pedantic person. And coincidentally, his subordinate Scarlet, Medisha, and even himself had mastered long-range attacks before they activated their elemental powers. Therefore, although the three of them only had the strength of silver, gold, and gold respectively, their combined lethality on the battlefield was terrifying. Scarlet's skills were all obtained through resonance with the lightning lance elemental powers. Back and forth, she could only use the thunder arrow slash. As for Medisha, as a fairy princess, before she came of age, she could only practice the basic sword skills of the elves. But after being transformed into a ghost knight, she learned charge, spirit lance, and thousand army strike. She was simply a moving cannon. He himself was even more abnormal. Although he was only a silver beginner, the battle skills in his hands would probably make anyone vomit blood. Charge, power burst, white raven sword arts, and frontal assault. Which one of them was not a dream skill for warriors? Not to mention the conflict aura that came with the badge, the wind bullet that came with the ring of the Wind Empress, and the fireball that came with the ring of the flame. At his level, Brando could not imagine any better treatment. After all, no matter how good the equipment was, there was still a limit to the will. He thought that those RMB warriors in the past were just like that. With these 3 people on the battlefield, the combat power of his side would increase by 1,000 times. Moreover, the luckiest thing was that regardless of whether it was Metasha or Scarlet, although they were strong, they were in fact just inexperienced little girls. Brando had gone around recruiting famous players in the past to form a team. He had already developed a glib tongue and deceived the 2 little girls. Oh, no. It should be said that it was a simple matter for him to win them over to his side. But compared to this, what made him more puzzled now was that he had already set up his position here, and the intention of the battle was already clear. Why was Conrad still not willing to appear? At this time, the Lizardmen army had been forced to the sides by the 3 of them. This way, with the powerful individual strength of the Silver Elves, they could completely guard the narrow gap on both sides and even take turns with the mercenaries to maintain their strength. The opponent should be able to see through this. But what was going on? He raised his head and looked around. At the same time, he secretly wondered if the opponent had found out that he was not Eek and gave up. Or was there another conspiracy? But this question was quickly answered. Just as he and Scarlet were repelling the 5th wave of lizard men, they suddenly heard Metasha shouting at them from the left flank. Careful! A strong wind came from the rear. What the hell, the enemy is underground. P.S. Continuous outbursts, half dead tired, a bit lacking stamina. In order to thank everyone for their support, I can only work hard to write. The prophetic emperor was joking once or twice. Is it fun to come to the book review section every day? To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 185. Brando turned around immediately, but the one who made the first move was indeed the Silver Fairy Princess, who discovered the enemy first. She was circling around 150 feet away and had just dispersed a group of lizardmen crossbowmen. At this time, many lizardmen warriors followed her and tried to surround the girl. But when Metasha turned around and saw the situation, she immediately warned the 2 of them and let her unicorn companion raise both of its hooves. At the same time, it raised its shuttle-shaped spear and stabbed forward with the momentum of the fall. Spear of the Spirit. The girl shouted, and then the wind pressure in front of the shuttle-shaped spear spread to both sides in an instant. The lizard men who were close to her were immediately vaporized, and those who were slightly further away were swept away like fallen leaves by the unparalleled force. The Silver Fairy Princess raised her spear and moved forward, and an invisible path suddenly opened in front of her. The fallen leaves danced, and the wind pressure swept by, and the trees in front of her exploded. The figure who shot towards Brando also flashed back in an instant. The wind pressure was like a knife cutting through the space between the 2 of them. Brando saw the deep scratch on the ground and could not help but break out in a cold sweat. He thought to himself, "My lady, can't you be a little gentler?" After all, he was confident that he could block the sneak attack of an opponent who had activated his elemental power. But if he was hit by the Spear of the Spirit, he would probably be seriously injured even if he did not die. After the cold sweat on his back, he finally had time to size up his opponent. In fact, he did not need to size up the monster in front of him. The huge monster that was as tall as 3 adults was injured in the end. Its long left hand grasped its right arm, and blood kept oozing from the wound below. This monster was a little like a humanoid insect. It was divided into 3 parts from its head, chest, and abdomen, and each part was covered with a complete grayish-yellow carapace. Just from the surface, one could tell that these carapaces were definitely not for decoration. Brando even suspected that they were at least 3 to 4 centimeters thick, and the stratum corneum, which was tempered by the spirit of the blood of God, was definitely stronger than steel. Even with a rough estimation, he could still give this thing an A+ defense rating. According to the other party's level, this grade of A+ defense rating was at least 15+, which was the defense of a main battle tank. Brendel felt himself groaning in pain. The monster's main limb was similar to an insect's limb, but its palm was more similar to a human's. Its abdomen also looked like an insect. It had a pair of appendages, and at the tip of the appendages was a pair of strange sickle-shaped blades that flickered with cold light. Below was a Z-shaped thigh, and the thigh was covered with barbs. There was no doubt that if an ordinary person was rubbed by it, the wound would definitely reveal the white bone. It also had an insect-like head, with antennae and knife-like pincers. A pair of large compound eyes indicated that this guy probably had terrifying low-light vision and precise tracking abilities. Fortunately, there were no hard or soft wings, which at least meant that it could not fly. This was probably the only good news that Brando got after seeing this thing. Looking at this monster, he knew that since he came to this world, this thing in front of him was probably the second boss monster that he had faced since the Golden Demonic Tree. It was the Earth Messenger, Ebden. However, compared to the weak level 30 boss like the Golden Demonic Tree, the Earth Messenger in front of him was still in its immature state. The difference between a level 55 boss and a level 30 boss was not as simple as 20 levels of growth. It was the difference between a level 55 boss and a level 30 boss. Brando took a deep breath. He knew that this would be the first real battle that he would face after coming to this world. If it wasn't for Scarlet and Medish's help, he would have run as far away as he could. But at this moment, there was a loud bang. He turned around and saw Scarlet colliding with an unfamiliar young man. She raised her lightning spear to parry the young man's attack. The young man grabbed her spear with a pair of sharp black steel gloves, and the lightning immediately resisted. But as soon as the flashing electric arc came close to the young man, it was mercilessly bounced off and could not hurt him at all. The young man grinned and sneered, "Isn't this our cute Scarlet? Betraying the organization so quickly and looking for a new lover. That guy's so-called blood of gods is really unreliable. But no matter, I can kill your companions and arrange for you to meet them." The red-haired girl gritted her teeth and glared at the young man with her fiery red eyes. She wanted nothing more than to stab him with her spear. The young man took a step back, and she immediately chased after him. But impulsiveness was never the way to win. The red-haired girl immediately felt her feet sinking. She looked down in shock and found that her feet were bound by a layer of black fog. She could not move at all. Magic. Scarlet's heart turned cold. This guy is a magic warrior. It was too late for her to react. Conrad used words to provoke her and waited for this moment. How could he let go of this opportunity? He stretched out his right claw and stabbed towards Scarlet's heart. The life force of an oracle was very strong, but the heart was the core of the blood of gods. Once the heart was injured, even if the oracle did not die immediately, her strength would decrease exponentially. Conrad knew that it would be difficult for him to protect himself under the attack of two gold-ranked fighters, so he used all his strength. His target was clear. Although Scarlet had obtained the strength of a gold-ranked fighter, she was the opposite of Brando. She did not have enough combat experience and only had strength. So although she was not the weakest among the three, in the eyes of the leader of the Paper Cards mercenaries, she was the easiest to kill. Unfortunately, if not for Brando, his wishful thinking would have succeeded. With her heart pierced, no matter how strong Scarlet's self-healing ability was, she would die. But at this moment, a sword appeared out of nowhere and blocked Conrad's claw. Brando did not hesitate to throw out his own sword. Of course, it was a useless weapon anyway, he thought. From the beginning of the battle, the young man saw it more clearly than Scarlet. Conrad's attack could be considered as magic, but more accurately, it was a magic trap. He did not expect the leader of the paper cards mercenaries to be a wizard hunter. This was really strange. Brando had rarely seen an NPC with the strength of a gold-ranked fighter. But this class was indeed very strong. It was a PvP class that was extremely difficult to level up, but strong in PvP. Conrad's speed of setting up the trap was so fast that even Brando almost did not see it clearly. To be able to fool his eyes, this was not something an ordinary person could do. It was not something that could be made up for by just having good skills. This guy probably had a talent, and it was probably a talent related to nimble fingers. And he should have learned the spirit chant skill, which was the only way to save the chanting time of the magic trap. But he did not know what other traps Conrad had used this passive skill on other than the illusion trap. This is going to be a little tricky. This thought only flashed through Brando's mind, but his body's reaction was much faster than his thoughts. In fact, when Scarlet felt her body stiffen, the young man had already grabbed her arm and dragged her back. Conrad's steel claws brushed past her chest and slid down. "Thanks, don't talk nonsense. Fortunately, you're a rare flat-chested girl," Brando secretly exclaimed, but when he looked up, he immediately saw Conrad's gloomy face. Conrad had attacked again. This guy also saw that not only did Brando see through his trick, but he also recognized his trap. In fact, the illusion trap was actually a kind of mental suggestion. It made people think that they had fallen into some kind of trap and subconsciously resisted their actions. But like most illusions, although others could see the effect of the trap, they would not be affected by it. But this was the secret of the wizard hunters, and he did not expect Brando to know about it. Of course, Brando knew about it. But this question in his view was completely different from Conrad's. In Erewhon and even the continent of Wonde, there were not many wizard hunters. Conrad not only obtained the certification of a superior hunter with his own identity, but also advanced to the gold level. After reaching this level, he began to gradually discover the benefits of this profession. Because there were not many wizard hunters who were familiar with their fighting style, there were even fewer people who were familiar with their fighting style. This was a huge advantage in actual combat. In the past, he had fought with many enemies who were stronger than him, and without exception, he used all kinds of strange attacking methods to finally win. But he did not expect that today. He finally met his opponent. This guy must die. Conrad's heart turned cold. He waved his claws forward, and Brando was so scared that he immediately used charge to retreat. What a joke. In the previous battle, he had already reached level 26. But even so, he only had around 50 ounces of strength under the condition of strength burst. Compared to a gold-level warrior who could easily exceed 100 ounces of strength, he did not want to take a free flight. Moreover, even if Conrad was only a wizard hunter who practiced both magic and martial arts, his strength was estimated to be around 80 to 90 ounces, and he was still not a match for him. Brando had 132 ounces of agility under the effect of strength burst. Not to mention Conrad, even the lightning elemental, who had the fastest speed among the gold-level warriors, could only look up to him. As soon as he retreated, the leader of paper cards swung his claw and slammed it on the ground. With a loud bang, the withered leaves within a 10-meter radius instantly turned into ashes, and the ground caved in, forming a huge crater. But when Conrad raised his head, he saw that the opponent was already 30 meters away. What kind of speed was this? Who is this guy? The leader of paper cards was stunned and forgot to chase after him. The young man in front of him was simply beyond his knowledge. Although he was young and had the strength of a silver level, Conrad himself was a genius. Of course, he would not think highly of Brando just because of this. Moreover, his target this time, the only son of Duke Lone, Eek, was also a genius. In comparison, Brando's strength was only mediocre. But even so, it seemed that this silver-level guy's strength was a little off the charts. Conrad was secretly shocked. He himself had extraordinary experience and learned all kinds of combat skills. He was confident that even if he faced an enemy of the upper gold level, he would still have the strength to fight, and he was deeply proud of this fact. But he did not expect that after 3 to 4 moves, he would only be able to fight to a draw with a silver level guy. Furthermore, with the speed of the opponent's retreat, he naturally suspected that it was the Sun Knight order. This guy was a Sun Knight. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 186. While Brando and Conrad were fighting, Hugel had already ordered his lizard men to split into 2 directions to bypass the center of the battlefield and enter the ruins from both sides. But the Silver Elves were already waiting for them. Nalathar divided his warriors into 2 groups, one led by himself and the other under the command of the Nightsong Tiger. Both sides guarded the side entrance of the ruins, and they quickly clashed with the lizard men that were coming out of the forest. These barbaric and simple-minded creatures screamed as they rushed out of the forest. They were agile and quickly rushed up the ruins of the elven buildings, but what awaited them was a flash of snow. The elven warriors looked down from above and pierced the throats of these beasts with their double-ended swords. Then they used their elbows to push the corpses away and threw them into the ruins. At the edge of the elven ruins, the moment the dark green tide collided with the silver line, 7 or 8 lizard men were thrown far away. They fell into the crowd of their own kind and knocked down quite a few people. The lizardmen's attack suddenly stopped. How could Lopez and the Grey Wolves mercenaries who were hiding in the back let go of this opportunity? They immediately released arrows from their bowstrings. Bang, bang, bang. The arrows formed a white line that extended from the back of the ruins to the front. These white lines extended into the lizardmen's formation, and it was as if they had hit an invisible wall. These dark green and slender warriors fell back in rows. In wound, a normal person who had received proper training could shoot 6 times in a minute. Not to mention these experienced mercenaries whose agility and strength were more than 10 times or even 20 times that of an ordinary person. Even if they were using a heavy 4-armed crossbow, they could still fire 15 to 20 bolts in a minute. That was a disaster for the lizard men. When the rain of steel fell on their heads, it was as if a grim reaper wearing a black cloak and holding a scythe had swept past their heads and slashed their ranks with the scythe. Just like that, death occurred one after another. The platoon leaders and the lizard men lieutenants at the back of the platoon tried to mobilize the crossbowmen to counterattack, but most of the lizard men crossbowmen had not even reached the level of iron grade. Most of the lizard men crossbowmen had not even reached the level of iron grade, and some of them had just reached this level but had not undergone any formal training. Moreover, the closest crossbowman squad had already been scattered by Medisa at the beginning of the battle. Although the Silver Fairy Princess was of the royal family, she was still born and wound during the most chaotic time of the war. She was able to grasp the situation on the battlefield and had already become an instinct. Without cover and ranged attacks, the lizard men began to stagnate and retreat. The elven commander with the golden helmet looked down and immediately took out the dragon horn from his waist and blew into it. The long tune of the horn had been ingrained in the hearts of these warriors for 7 centuries because it only meant one thing: charge. The Silver Elves raised their hands and placed their shiny double-ended swords on their right chests. Who are we? The sword of Aharan. Nalathar nodded and swung his sword downwards. The Silver Elves roared in unison and charged forward. It was like mercury pouring down from the sky. The lizard men had no way to defend themselves. Not only did they have to face a group of silver-ranked warriors, they also had to face 11 battle masters. The mercenaries' ranged attacks began to extend to the rear. In just one round, they had already destroyed 7 of their heavy crossbows. When the last one was taken away, Sanford had no choice but to switch to a short bow. Even so, the young man still felt his blood boiling. Less than 70 steps away, there was an endless army of dark green that stretched all the way to the edge of the forest. But no matter how hard the lizard men charged, they could not cross the silver line. Not only that, the silver elves also took the initiative to charge forward. With only 10 of them, they charged towards hundreds of lizard men. This was a real battle. Sanford could feel his blood boiling as he listened to the elves singing their ancient battle song. A shiver ran through his body. It was as if he had returned to the ancient battlefield that existed to fight against the forces of darkness. That was a magnificent war. Truly, all the races and races gave it their all, fighting for freedom and honor. It was an epic war. Sanford returned fire with his short bow. He felt that he had fallen in love with this feeling. It was not just about becoming a mercenary. When the horn sounded, it was like a dragon's roar that swept across the battlefield. No matter how far away they were, almost everyone stopped moving. It was the war horn of the Silver Elves. Conrad's expression changed again. From his position, he could not see the 2 sides that were blocked by the forest. Naturally, he did not know what was happening there. But the sound of the horn did not lie. After 300 years of seclusion, the Silver Elves had appeared once again. The leader of the paper cards was convinced that Hugel, the leader of the lizard men, was the one who screwed up the entire mission. But he wasn't thinking about how to find that useless lizard man and beat it up. That damned lizard man would not have a good ending, and he did not want to lose his life here. The horn could only mean one thing. One of the strongest fighting forces of the Silver Elves, the Phoenix Guards, had appeared on the battlefield. But he did not know if the Elven Knights and the Hymnal Knight, Unicorn Knight, were also here. If that was the case, he would not even have a place to cry. The Hymnal Knight was the legendary army that sang the ancient song of the Silver Elven Empire and charged towards the Myrna army that numbered more than 100,000. Thinking of this, he did not want to fight anymore. He only glared at Brando, who was not far away, and retreated. The wizard hunter's agility was not low. Conrad's figure floated backwards, like a withered leaf that was about to disappear into the background of the forest. Brando was stunned. He was afraid that Conrad would go around them and cause trouble. At this moment, the Silver Elves were still able to deal with the lizard men, but if a low gold-ranked wizard hunter was involved, it would be hard to say. He immediately shouted to the Silver Fairy Princess who was rushing towards them, Metisha. Stop him. In fact, Metisha did not need him to remind her. She had already thought of this. She leveled her spear and immediately activated the charge ability. The Unicorn Knight's speed was already frightening. At this moment, she was like a silver comet, drawing a beautiful arc along the edge of the forest. In the next moment, she blocked Conrad's path of retreat. Mr. Conrad, you have done too much evil. Please stay here and your companions. You have disregarded the dignity of the living and desecrated the eternal peace of the dead. You have to pay the price. Metisha held her spear horizontally and ordered her unicorn companion to turn around to face this man in a black and red cloak. She said with a clear voice. Conrad secretly gritted his teeth. He did not want to say anything more to this Silver Elven Knight. Brando's order deepened his suspicions. The other party seemed to have a card up his sleeve and was determined to make them stay here. This was a trap. Although he did not know what relationship this group of people had with the Grey Wolves mercenaries in Eek, he was already deeply vigilant. Hey, bitches of the Hymnal Knight. He cursed in his heart and turned around to flee in a direction. But how could his speed be compared to a unicorn? When he turned around, the Silver Fairy Princess was already waiting for him with a cold face. Conrad tried 3 times, but he was stopped in the same way all 3 times. He was starting to panic. Since the other party dared to stop him without any fear, they must have something up their sleeves. The only thing he could think of was the ancient empire. The tree herders were not afraid of these arrogant tree stumps, but he was not. He did not dare to think that he could deceive this silver elven girl like how he deceived the red-haired girl. Right in front of him was one of the most skilled warriors in the continent. Only an idiot would hope that such an opponent would make a mistake. So, it seemed that there was only one way. When Medisha stopped Conrad, Brando, who had just grabbed Scarlet's arm and retreated, felt his vision darken. A cold and dangerous aura rushed towards him. The young man did not even need to think to know what it was. It was the Earth's messenger, Ekman. It was the only one who could keep up with his charging speed. The gigantic monster raised its forelimbs. Its height was 3 times that of an adult's and it seemed to block out the sun. Then, it roared and slashed forward. The air became restless. Brando felt as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly cracked open. Elemental power, rock strength, without a second thought, he hugged Scarlet and leaped into the air. Both of them rolled a few times in the forest. At the same time, Ekman slammed his palm down. With a loud bang, the ground was sent flying. Stone fangs shot up from both sides of the ground and bit into each other, forming a stone cage around Ekman's palm. To the onlookers, it looked as if the gigantic monster had slammed its paw down on the ground and formed 5 stone claws. But as soon as its paw left the ground, the stones crumbled into dust and returned to the forest. Brendel got up from the ground and sucked in a breath of cold air. Even though the guide mentioned Ekman's strength and preferred tactics, it was a completely different feeling when he faced him in person. Right now, he felt as if he had returned to the time when he was level 40. At that time, Torrential Rain released a new version of the game, the Sanctum Knight. It was the first time he, Scarlet, and the others participated in a raid on a new map. The legendary boss who had awakened his elemental power had left a deep impression on them. That was the first time the players learned about the Sanctum Knight and the realm of elemental power. But now, it seemed that he had to reevaluate this realm. P.S. I made a stupid mistake when I wrote this yesterday. The Earth's messenger said that it was called Ekman. But that was understandable. After all, you know that it's hard to tell what an insect is called, especially when they don't know how to pronounce. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.